deleted everything 3 weeks ago, wiped my laptop, threw away my external drives, even got rid of my phone and bought a new one. People think digital footprints are permanent, but you'd be surprised how thoroughly you can erase yourself if you're motivated enough. And I was very, very motivated. The thing is, I know it won't matter. They already have what they need. But doing something, anything, made me feel slightly less powerless, slightly less complicit in what happened. I should probably explain what I mean by that, what I did, what I saw. I'm a freelance photographer, or haven't picked up my camera in months now. I used to do wedding photography mainly, the occasional corporate event, sometimes product shoots for small businesses trying to look more professional than they actually were. It paid the bills, barely, and I was good at it. Had that ability to make people look natural even when they were deeply uncomfortable, which is apparently a valuable skill when you're photographing someone's awkward second cousin at a wedding reception in Nottingham. The work dried up during the lockdowns, obviously. Weddings postponed indefinitely. Businesses closing. Nobody wanting a photographer within 2 meters of them. I burned through my savings in about 4 months, then started living on credit cards, then started getting very creative about what constituted an essential expense. By the time things started opening up again, I was in debt up to my eyeballs and absolutely desperate for work. But the photography industry had changed. Everyone with a decent phone camera suddenly thought they were professionals. Prices had collapsed. The jobs I used to get offered for 400 or 500 quid were now going for 100, sometimes less. I was applying for everything, undercutting my own rates, and still barely getting responses. That's when I started looking for alternative income. Not because I wanted to do anything illegal or dodgy. I just needed money, and I needed it quickly. I'd heard about people selling stock photography online, licensing images to websites and publications. It seemed simple enough. Take some decent photographs, upload them to stock sites, earn a few quid every time someone downloaded them. The problem was that stock photography is incredibly oversaturated. Millions of images of people having breakfast or shaking hands in offices or staring pensively at sunsets. My photos were fine, perfectly competent, but they disappeared into the noise. I made maybe £30 in 2 months. Then I stumbled across a discussion thread. This was on the regular internet, nothing dark or hidden, where photographers were talking about niche markets. Apparently, there was decent money in very specific types of stock imagery that mainstream sites didn't cater to. Medical photos, industrial photography, that sort of thing. One person mentioned that the real money was in custom requests, if you knew where to find them. Someone in the replies mentioned the dark web, said there were communities there that paid significantly better for specific types of photography, no questions asked. I'd heard about the dark web before, obviously, but only in that vague way everyone has. Drugs and hitmen and stolen credit cards. The idea of it being a marketplace for legitimate services hadn't really occurred to me. I was skeptical at first, but I was also eviction notice desperate. And desperate people do stupid things. Getting access wasn't particularly complicated. Took me an evening of following guides and figuring out how to browse anonymously. And then I was there, looking at websites that resembled something from the late 90s, all text and minimal formatting. I spent a few days just exploring, trying to understand how it all worked. There were marketplaces, sure, selling exactly the kinds of things you'd expect, but there were also service listings. People offering skills ranging from graphic design to translation to consultation. And there were photography requests. Most of them were straightforward. Someone wanted photos of a specific building in Birmingham from multiple angles, probably for something architectural or planning related. Someone else wanted candid street photography from Manchester city centre during specific times of day. The pay was decent, much better than stock photography, and payment was arranged through methods I won't detail here, but which seemed secure enough. I started taking those jobs. Nothing sinister, nothing that made me uncomfortable. Just photography with specific requirements, delivered anonymously, paid reasonably well. It kept me afloat, paid down some of my debt, let me breathe a bit easier. The requests got more specific over time. Someone wanted photographs of a particular house in Leeds, exterior shots only, taken at different times of day across a week. Someone else wanted images of the interior of a specific pub in Newcastle, as detailed as possible. I told myself these were probably for property assessments or business valuations, things that needed to be done anonymously for whatever reason. I never asked questions. That was the unspoken rule. You fulfilled the request exactly as specified, delivered the images, got paid, moved on. No communication beyond the initial brief. Then I got a request that paid significantly more than anything I'd seen before. Almost £3,000 for what seemed like a simple job. Someone wanted photographs of a specific flat in Bristol. Interior shots as comprehensive as possible. Every room, every angle. They'd provide access. There'd be a key hidden near the property, and I'd have a 2-hour window when the flat would definitely be empty. £3,000. That was 2 months of rent, a massive chunk off my credit cards, breathing room I desperately needed. I should have questioned why someone would pay that much. Should have wondered why they couldn't just hire a normal photographer through normal channels. Should have asked myself what possible legitimate reasons someone would have for wanting detailed photographs of someone else's flat without their knowledge. But I didn't. I just accepted the job. The flat was in a converted Victorian house in Clifton, the nice part of Bristol. The key was exactly where they said it would be, tucked behind a loose brick near the entrance. The flat itself was on the 2nd floor. I let myself in during the specified window. A Tuesday afternoon, middle of the day, when presumably the occupant was at work. It was a woman's flat clearly, neat but lived in, books on the shelves, photos on the walls, the kind of space that felt like someone actually inhabited it, rather than just existed there. I felt sick doing it, moving through her private space with my camera. But I told myself I was just taking photos, not stealing anything, not damaging anything, just photographs. I shot everything as requested, the living room from multiple angles, the kitchen, including inside the cupboards and fridge as specified, the bathroom, the bedroom, which felt like the worst violation somehow, photographing someone's unmade bed and the clothes draped over a chair and the books on their nightstand. There were photos of her throughout the flat, with friends, with family, on holiday. She looked happy in them, normal, completely unaware that a stranger would soon be standing in her bedroom, documenting every detail of her private life. I finished the job, locked up, replaced the key, uploaded the photographs through the secure method they'd specified. The payment came through within hours. I tried not to think about it, tried to tell myself it was probably for insurance purposes or some kind of property dispute, but I knew that was rubbish. Nobody pays £3,000 for insurance photos. Nobody needs that level of detail, that invasion of privacy, for any legitimate purpose. I knew what those photos were probably for. Either someone planning to rob her, or someone obsessed with her, or something worse I didn't want to imagine. And I'd helped them. I'd provided the tools for whatever was going to happen. But I'd also been paid £3,000, and my landlord had stopped sending threatening letters, and I could buy food without calculating the cost of every item. So I took the money and tried to forget about it. A week later, I got another request. Same type of job, different location, A house in Southampton this time. £4,000. Again, access would be provided. Specific time window. Comprehensive interior photography required. I told myself I wouldn't do it. Told myself the Bristol job had been a one-off moment of desperation, and I was better than this. But £4,000. Christ, I did the job. And then I did another one. And another. Over about 3 months, I photographed the interiors of maybe a dozen properties across England. Houses, flats, even a few businesses. Always the same pattern. Generous payment provided access, specific window of time, detailed photography required. The money was extraordinary. I cleared my debts completely, built up savings, could have stopped doing it at any time. But I didn't stop. That's the thing I'm most ashamed of. It wasn't desperation anymore. It was just greed. Easy money for a few hours of work. I'd gotten good at not thinking about what the photos might be used for, at compartmentalizing the ethics of it. Then came the request that changed everything. It was for a flat in Reading. The pay was higher than usual, almost £6,000. The brief was similar to previous jobs. Comprehensive interior photography during a specified time window. But this one included an additional file. A photograph of the occupant, presumably so I'd know whose flat I was documenting. I shouldn't have opened that file. Should have just declined the job right there. But I clicked it. The photograph showed a young woman, mid-20s probably, dark hair, sitting in what looked like a cafe. She was looking at her phone, unaware she was being photographed. There was something about the image that made my skin crawl. The angle suggested it had been taken from across the street, through a window. This wasn't a social media photo or a casual snapshot. This was surveillance. Below the image was a single line of text. Usual requirements plus any personal items of interest. Personal items of interest. What the hell did that mean? Diaries, computers, underwear. I stared at that request for hours. This wasn't about property valuation or insurance. This was about a woman who was being watched, being targeted, by someone who was now asking me to help them get closer to her, to provide an intimate map of her private life. I should have refused, should have deleted everything and never gone back to that site. But £6,000, I hate myself for what I did next. I hate that I can't even claim it was desperation or stupidity. It was just pure, calculating greed. I accepted the job. The flat was in a modern building near the town centre. Nice area, secure entrance, the kind of place where you'd feel safe. The key was hidden as usual, the time window specified. 2 hours during a Thursday afternoon. I let myself in and immediately knew something was different. The flat felt lived in a way the others hadn't. There were plants on the windowsill, properly cared for, fresh flowers in a vase. A calendar on the wall with neat handwriting marking various appointments. This wasn't just someone's space, it was someone's carefully maintained life. I started with the main rooms as usual. Living room, kitchen, bathroom. Standard shots from multiple angles. But I kept noticing details that made me increasingly uncomfortable. A medical alert bracelet on the bedside table. Prescription medication in the bathroom cabinet. A walking stick leaning against the wall near the door. This woman was vulnerable somehow, and someone was paying me £6,000 to document every aspect of her private space. I should have stopped. Should have walked out right then. But I was already there, already inside, already complicit. So I kept going. The bedroom was worse than the others had been. More personal somehow. There were photos everywhere. Family photos, friend photos, holiday photos. A whole life documented on the walls. I photographed them all as requested, hating myself more with every click of the shutter. Then I found the laptop on her desk. It was closed, probably in sleep mode. The request had mentioned personal items of interest. Did they want me to open it, go through her files? I stood there for a long time, trying to decide. Part of me knew that opening that laptop would cross a line I couldn't uncross. The photography was bad enough, but this felt like something darker. In the end, I didn't open it. I just photographed it, photographed the desk around it, moved on. I finished the job quickly after that, desperate to be out of there. Locked up, replaced the key, went home feeling filthy in a way that had nothing to do with physical dirt. I uploaded the photographs that night and waited for payment. It came through within a few hours, same as always. £6,000 appearing in my account like nothing had happened. Like I hadn't just violated a stranger's privacy in the most intimate way possible. I tried to forget about it, tried to go back to normal life, normal photography work, but I couldn't stop thinking about that flat in Reading, about the woman in the photograph, going about her life, completely unaware that someone had been inside her home, documenting everything. 3 weeks later, I saw a news article. A woman in Reading had been attacked in her own flat by an intruder. He'd somehow gained access to the building, let himself into her flat with a key, waited for her to come home. She'd survived, but was in hospital with serious injuries. The police were appealing for information. The article included a photograph of the victim. I recognized her immediately. The same dark hair, the same face I'd seen in that surveillance photo. I felt physically sick. Actually had to run to the bathroom and throw up, because I'd helped that happen. Maybe the person who'd attacked her was the same person who'd hired me. Maybe it was someone they'd sold the information to. Maybe it was even more removed than that. But the chain of cause and effect was clear. My photographs had helped someone hurt that woman. I stopped taking those jobs immediately, stopped going on the dark web at all. But the damage was done. I'd enabled something terrible, and there was nothing I could do to take it back. I reported it to the police eventually. Anonymous tip, no personal details. Told them about the photography requests, the dark web marketplace, everything I knew. I don't know if they took it seriously, or if they could even do anything with that information. The dark web isn't easy to investigate, and I couldn't provide much in the way of useful details. The woman survived, I found out later. The man who attacked her was arrested a few weeks after, caught trying to do the same thing to someone else. He had photographs on his computer, detailed interior shots of multiple properties. Some of them were mine. I recognized my own work. Other photographers had been doing the same jobs I had, helping him prepare, providing reconnaissance. We weren't the ones who hurt those women, but we'd built the ladder someone else climbed. I still think about those flats sometimes, about the people whose homes I violated, whose private lives I documented and sold. I wonder if they ever found out, if they ever felt that creeping sense that someone had been in their space, touching their things, learning their secrets. I wonder if the woman in Reading ever feels safe in her own home now, if she looks at her possessions differently, knowing that someone photographed them, studied them, used that knowledge to hurt her. I've got money saved now, enough to live on for a while without working. But every time I look at that bank balance, I see those flats, those private spaces I shouldn't have been in. That woman's face in the news article, blood money, that's what they used to call it, isn't it? Money earned through harm. I thought I was just taking photographs, thought I could separate the action from the consequence, tell myself I was just providing a service and what happened after wasn't my responsibility. But it was. It is. I helped hurt people because I wanted money, and no amount of rationalizing changes that. The worst part is how easy it was, How quickly I went from desperate to greedy, from one questionable job to a dozen, from feeling sick about it to barely thinking about it at all. That's what frightens me most. Not what I did, but how simple it was to do. How easy it is to become complicit in terrible things when you're just trying to get by. I've thought about going to therapy, talking to someone about what happened. But what would I even say? That I'm traumatized by my own choices. That I'm struggling with guilt over something I did willingly, repeatedly for months. I don't deserve sympathy. The woman in Reading does. The other people whose homes I violated do. I just deserve to live with what I've done. So I deleted everything, like I said at the start. Wiped it all clean. But you can't wipe your memory. Can't delete the knowledge of what you're capable of when circumstances push you in the wrong direction. I see that woman's face sometimes when I close my eyes. The one from the surveillance photo, sitting in that cafe, looking at her phone, completely unaware that her life was about to be invaded. Completely unaware that somewhere out there was a photographer desperate enough and greedy enough to help make that invasion possible. That photographer was me. I did that, and I'll carry that knowledge for the rest of my life. I probably shouldn't have kept that laptop. Even now, sat here in my new flat in Bristol, I can feel the weight of what I found on it pressing against my chest like a stone. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, though I'm not sure I want to remember it all. My gran died last February. There wasn't anything particularly dramatic about it. She was 87 and had been declining for months. The funeral was small, just family, and afterwards we had the grim task of clearing out her bungalow in Colchester. You know how it is with elderly relatives. Decades of accumulated possessions that seemed important to them but mean nothing to anyone else. I was sorting through her spare bedroom when I found the laptop. It was tucked away in the wardrobe behind some old curtains, still in its original packaging from about 5 years ago. A birthday present from my uncle that she'd never bothered to set up, probably because she could barely work her mobile phone, let alone a computer. My uncle suggested I take it. He felt it was a shame to let it go to waste, as I could probably get some use out of it. My laptop had been playing up for months, randomly shutting down and taking ages to boot up. So I boxed it up with some of Gran's photo albums and a few bits of jewelry she'd left me, and forgot about it for a while. It wasn't until about a month later that I actually got round to setting the thing up. I work in museum conservation, which means I spend most of my day dealing with fragile old objects. So there's something ironic about the fact that I'm useless with modern technology. It took me the better part of an evening just to get through the initial setup process. The laptop came with all sorts of software pre-installed, including some programs I'd never heard of. Most of it looked like bloatware, trial versions of security software and productivity apps that I'd never use. But there was one program that caught my attention, partly because it had a name I didn't recognize, and partly because when I clicked on it, nothing seemed to happen. I almost deleted it, thinking it was broken or corrupted somehow. But curiosity got the better of me. I'm good at researching things. It comes with the job. So I spent some time looking up what this software actually did. Turns out it was something called a privacy browser, designed to access parts of the internet that normal browsers can't reach. Now, I'm not completely naive. I'd heard about the dark web before, mostly from crime documentaries and news reports about drug dealers and worse things. But I'd always assumed it was something only criminals and computer experts knew how to use. I had no idea you could access it with software that came pre-installed on a consumer laptop. The more I read about it, the more curious I became. I've always been interested in hidden things, not because I wanted to buy anything illegal or get involved in anything dubious. It's probably why I ended up working in museums. There's something appealing about uncovering objects and stories that have been forgotten or lost. So one evening, after a particularly tedious day spent cataloguing Victorian pottery, I decided to have a look, just to see what was there, you understand. I wasn't planning to do anything except satisfy my curiosity. The first thing that struck me was how ordinary it all looked. I'd expected something sinister and obviously criminal, but most of the sites I found seemed fairly mundane. There were message boards discussing privacy and security, online libraries with books you couldn't find elsewhere, even what looked like normal shopping sites, except with unusual payment methods. But then I started exploring more systematically, following links from one site to another. That's when I found something that made me sit back from the screen and wonder if I should close the laptop immediately. The site appeared to be a hybrid of a social media platform and a classified ad section. People posting requests for specific types of information, others offering to fulfill those requests in exchange for similar favors. Nothing obviously illegal, but something about the whole setup felt wrong. The language was too careful, too coded, like everyone was trying to say something without actually saying it. Most of the posts were incomprehensible to me, references to things I didn't understand, using terms that meant nothing. But there was one section that caught my attention because the requests were much more straightforward. People asking for information about specific individuals, full names, addresses, places of work, daily routines. At first, I assumed it was some sort of private investigation service, maybe people trying to track down old friends or investigate potential employees. But the more I read, the more uncomfortable I became. The requests were too detailed, too invasive. People wanting to know what time someone left for work, which route they took, whether they lived alone. One post in particular stuck with me. Someone had uploaded what looked like a floor plan of a house, hand-drawn, but surprisingly detailed. They were asking for information about the person who lived there, a woman in her 30s who worked as a teacher in somewhere called Melton Mowbray. The post included her full name, her school, even the make and color of her car. The comments underneath were worse than the original post. People offering additional information about this woman, where she did her weekly shopping, which gym she went to, what time she usually got home from work. One comment even included photographs of her house taken from different angles, showing all the windows and entrances. I should have closed the browser then, should have deleted the software and pretended I'd never seen any of it. But instead, I found myself scrolling through more posts, each one more invasive than the last. People sharing detailed surveillance information about complete strangers, building up comprehensive profiles of their targets' lives. What disturbed me most was how organized it all seemed. This wasn't random harassment or casual stalking. It was systematic information gathering on an industrial scale. People were trading details about their neighbors and colleagues, building a vast database of personal information about ordinary people who had no idea they were being monitored. I spent the next few evenings exploring the site, telling myself I was trying to understand how it worked and who was behind it. But really, I think I was just morbidly fascinated by the scope of it all. There were thousands of posts, tens of thousands of comments, all documenting the private lives of people across the country. Some posts focused on specific professions: teachers, nurses, social workers. Others targeted women living alone or families with young children. There were requests for information about people's work schedules, their relationships, their financial situations, all presented in the same matter-of-fact tone. as if this kind of surveillance was perfectly normal. Then I found the section that changed everything. It was called Local Collections, and it was organized by area. I clicked on the East of England section more out of idle curiosity than anything else, expecting to find the same sort of content I'd been seeing elsewhere on the site. Instead, I found a detailed profile of my gran, not just her name and address, but photographs of her bungalow taken from the street and the back garden. Details about her daily routine, what time she put her bins out, when she went to the shops, which days the home help visited. Someone had even documented her medical appointments, noting when she seemed particularly frail or confused. The post was months old, dating back to when she was still alive and living independently. Someone had been watching her, cataloguing her movements, sharing intimate details about her declining health with strangers on the internet. The comments underneath discussed how easy it would be to gain access to her house, speculating about whether she kept cash or valuables inside. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the thread. There were dozens of photographs, taken over what looked like several weeks. My gran hanging washing on her line, struggling with her walking frame, even sitting in her front window doing crossword puzzles, all captured by someone with a long lens camera, someone who had made a project out of documenting her vulnerability. But it was the final comment in the thread that made me feel physically sick. Posted just a few days after Gran's funeral, it simply read, "Property now empty." The family continues to visit occasionally to organize their belongings. It might be opportunities for interior documentation. Someone had been monitoring the house even after she died, watching as we came and went, planning to break in and photograph the inside of her home while we were busy with the legal paperwork and funeral arrangements. I slammed the laptop shut and walked away from it. Made myself a cup of tea with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, trying to process what I'd just discovered. My gran, who had worried about leaving her door unlocked when she popped to the corner shop, had been under surveillance by strangers who treated her life like entertainment, but I couldn't leave it alone. The next evening, I opened the laptop again and went straight back to the site. I told myself I needed to understand how widespread this was, whether other people I knew were being targeted. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. The local collections section covered the entire country. Every major city, most smaller towns, even rural villages. Countless profiles exist, each meticulously detailing an individual's personal life. I recognized some of the locations, places I'd lived, areas where friends and family still lived. I started searching for people I knew. My parents in their retirement bungalow in Devon. My sister and her family in their semi-detached house in Reading. My ex-boyfriend who still lived in the flat we used to share in Cambridge. I found profiles for all of them. My parents were listed under a section for vulnerable elderly targets. Someone had documented their routine visits to the local garden centre, noted that my father had mobility issues, even identified which days they left the house empty to visit my sister. The post included photographs of them loading shopping into their car and detailed observations about their physical limitations. My sister's profile was in a section focused on family surveillance opportunities. The post included photographs of her children walking to school, details about her husband's work schedule, even floor plans of their house that someone had apparently sketched while pretending to be doing market research door to door. But it was my ex-boyfriend's profile that made me realize the true scope of what I was looking at. The post wasn't just about him. It connected to dozens of other profiles, all people who lived in the same area or worked at the same company. Someone was building a comprehensive map of an entire community, documenting the relationships between different targets, identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Each profile contained hundreds of photographs and observations, stretching back months or even years. This wasn't casual surveillance. It was a systematic intelligence gathering operation targeting ordinary people. And it was being carried out by what appeared to be a network of volunteers who treated the whole thing like a hobby. I spent the next week diving deeper into the site, trying to understand how it was organized and who was behind it. The more I learned, the more frightened I became. This wasn't just about information gathering. People were using the surveillance data to plan break-ins, to identify vulnerable targets, even to coordinate harassment campaigns. There were posts discussing the best times to approach certain targets, sharing techniques for gaining access to their homes, even coordinating group activities to maximize the psychological impact on specific individuals. They all spoke in a casual, matter-of-fact manner, giving the impression that they were organizing a charity event instead of conducting stalker campaigns. The worst part was discovering how they recruited new participants. The site had a section for community outreach, where experienced members offered to train newcomers in surveillance techniques. They provided guides on camera equipment, advice on following targets without being detected, even legal advice on how to avoid prosecution if caught. They were turning voyeurism and stalking into a social activity, building a community around the violation of other people's privacy. And they were doing it all on a part of the internet that most people didn't even know existed, making them effectively immune from normal law enforcement. I found myself checking the site compulsively, looking for new posts about people I knew, trying to understand the scale of the surveillance network. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion, horrifying but impossible to look away from. That's when I started noticing changes in my own behavior. I became hyper-aware of people around me, wondering if they might be part of the surveillance network. I started varying my routes to work, checking my windows for signs of tampering, even covering my laptop camera when I wasn't using it. But the paranoia got worse when I found my own profile on the site. It wasn't comprehensive like some of the others, just a basic entry with my name, workplace, and a few photographs of me walking to the museum. But seeing my own life reduced to a surveillance target's profile made me realize that I wasn't just an observer of this network. I was also a potential victim. The post about me was recent, probably created after someone noticed me visiting the site regularly. The comments underneath discussed my search behavior and speculated about whether I might be a journalist or law enforcement officer. Someone had even identified the museum where I worked and suggested that my access to valuable objects might make me an interesting target for development. That was when I knew I had to stop. Not just stop using the site, but get rid of the laptop entirely and try to forget what I discovered. Because the longer I stayed connected to this network, the more likely I was to become a target myself. I deleted all the software from the laptop and sold it to a second-hand shop in town. Then I moved to Bristol, telling myself it was for a better job opportunity, rather than because I was running away from something I couldn't fight. But I still think about what I found on that site. All those ordinary people living their lives with no idea they're being watched, catalogued, discussed by strangers who see them as nothing more than sources of entertainment. My my parents, my sister's children, all reduced to entries in someone else's collection of surveillance data. The worst part is knowing that the network is still out there, still growing, still documenting the private lives of people who trust that their homes are safe spaces. And there's nothing I can do to stop it, because they operate in the shadows where normal rules don't apply. Sometimes I wonder if they know I found them, whether my own profile has been updated to reflect my new location, my new job, my new routines, whether someone in Bristol is already taking photographs of me walking to work, noting what time I come home, building up a comprehensive picture of my vulnerability. But I try not to think about it too much, because once you know that these networks exist and understand how systematic and organized they are, you can never really feel safe again. You just have to hope that you're not interesting enough to warrant their attention. If someone told you they'd found the perfect job that paid 3 times your current salary for half the hours, you'd probably assume there was something seriously wrong with it. But desperation has a way of making obvious red flags look like minor inconveniences you can work around. I was 29 and completely broke in Sheffield, trying to make freelance copywriting work while my savings dwindled, and my landlord started leaving increasingly pointed messages about late rent payments. The gig economy had turned out to be considerably less flexible and lucrative than advertised, leaving me scrambling for any work that might pay actual money instead of exposure and experience. That's when I saw the job listing that seemed too good to be true. Content writer for a digital marketing company, remote work, 30,000 a year for 20 hours a week. The only requirements were strong writing skills and what they called comfort with unconventional subject matter. The company was called Meridian Content Solutions, which sounded professional enough, and their website showcased previous work for various corporate clients. Nothing spectacular, but legitimate-looking marketing copy for businesses I'd never heard of, but which seemed real enough. I applied immediately, sending samples of my best copywriting along with a cover letter that probably sounded more desperate than professional. Within hours, I received a response asking if I was available for a phone interview the following morning. The interview went better than expected. The hiring manager was professional but friendly, asking standard questions about my experience and writing process. She seemed impressed by my portfolio and explained that they needed writers who could adapt to different client requirements without getting overwhelmed by unusual content requests. Some clients wanted marketing copy for products or services that existed in legal grey areas, she explained, requiring writers who could focus on technical accuracy and persuasive language without worrying too much about the ethical implications of what they were promoting. The work would involve creating content for various digital platforms, including some that weren't accessible through mainstream internet channels. Clients in these specialized markets were willing to pay premium rates for quality writing, which explained the generous salary for part-time work. She offered me the position on the spot, sending contracts and payment information that looked legitimate and professional. The salary would be paid monthly into my bank account, with no complex freelancer tax arrangements or delayed payment terms. I accepted immediately, reasoning that even if the work turned out to be questionable, the income would solve my immediate financial problems and give me breathing room to find something more conventional. My first assignment was writing product descriptions for what appeared to be a high-end security consultation service. The copy needed to emphasize discretion, expertise, and results, while avoiding specific details about methodology or client outcomes. The writing challenge was interesting, creating marketing materials that sounded impressive and professional, while remaining deliberately vague about actual services provided. It required the sort of creative ambiguity that demonstrated genuine copywriting skill. The client feedback was positive, and I quickly received additional assignments for similar security and privacy-focused businesses. The work was challenging but engaging, requiring me to research unfamiliar industries while maintaining the professional tone that luxury service providers expected. After about a month of steady work, I was assigned to create content for clients who operated through what my manager called alternative digital platforms. The copy would be published on websites that required special access methods, targeting audiences who weren't reached through conventional marketing channels. The technical requirements were more complex than anything I'd worked with before, involving software that connected to parts of the internet I'd never encountered. But the pay rate was even higher, and the writing challenges were genuinely stimulating. The first alternative platform assignment was creating promotional materials for a private investigation service that specialized in what they called deep background research. The copy needed to appeal to clients who required information that wasn't available through conventional investigative methods. The writing required balancing professionalism with hints about capabilities that couldn't be advertised openly, creating marketing materials that communicated expertise without making specific claims about illegal or unethical research methods. As I worked on more assignments for alternative platform clients, I started understanding that these businesses operated in areas where traditional advertising wasn't possible or effective. They needed marketing copy that could communicate their value to sophisticated audiences while maintaining plausible deniability about activities that might not be entirely legal. The writing challenges were intellectually engaging, requiring research into complex subjects and careful language choices that could imply capabilities without stating them directly. It was the sort of copywriting that demanded genuine skill and creativity. But I also started noticing that some assignments involved creating content for services that seemed to go beyond legal grey areas into activities that were clearly harmful to other people. One project required marketing materials for what was described as a social influence consulting service that helped clients manipulate online discussions and reputation management through coordinated harassment and misinformation campaigns. Another assignment involved promotional copy for a service that provided competitive intelligence through systematic surveillance and invasion of privacy targeting business rivals or personal enemies. The clients weren't just operating in legal grey areas, but were actively engaged in systematic harm to other individuals, using professional marketing copy to make their harmful services seem legitimate and appealing to potential customers. When I expressed concern about creating marketing materials for services that seemed designed to cause harm, my manager explained that all clients had been vetted for legitimacy and legal compliance. My role was to provide professional writing services, not to evaluate the ethics of client business models. She reminded me that copywriters regularly created marketing materials for industries they might personally find objectionable: tobacco, alcohol, gambling, even political campaigns. Professional writers focused on technical quality rather than moral judgment about client activities. The rationalization made sense from a business perspective, and the income was solving problems that had been causing genuine stress about housing and financial stability. I continued working on assignments while trying to focus on writing quality, rather than thinking too carefully about how my copy was being used. But as I created more marketing materials for alternative platform clients, I started recognizing that some services were targeting activities in Yorkshire, including Sheffield, and surrounding areas where I lived and worked. The competitive intelligence services I was writing for weren't abstractly harmful businesses operating in distant locations, but were actively targeting people in my own community for surveillance and harassment. Some marketing copy I'd written was being used to promote services that were probably causing genuine harm to neighbors and strangers who lived in the same city, where I was earning money by helping their tormentors market professional harassment services. I realized that my copywriting skills weren't just being used to promote questionable services, but were actively contributing to systematic harm affecting real people in my immediate geographic area. The marketing materials I created were helping harmful services seem professional and legitimate, making it easier for them to recruit clients who wanted to cause problems for specific individuals in Sheffield and surrounding areas. My writing was providing the professional credibility that made systematic harassment look like legitimate business services rather than criminal activity, helping harmful actors present their activities as technical consulting rather than organized cruelty. I tried to research Meridian Content Solutions more thoroughly, looking for verification that the company was legitimate and that my concerns about client activities were unfounded. What I discovered was disturbing. Meridian Content Solutions appeared to be a front company that existed primarily to recruit writers for creating marketing materials that made illegal or unethical services appear professional and legitimate. The company's business model was providing marketing support to harmful services that operated through hidden internet platforms, helping them recruit clients by presenting criminal activities as technical consulting or professional services. My writing skills weren't being used for legitimate digital marketing, but were essential infrastructure for helping harmful actors market their services to potential clients who might be deterred if they understood they were hiring criminals rather than professional consultants. The generous salary and flexible work arrangements had been designed to recruit writers who had financial pressures that would make them willing to overlook ethical concerns about client activities in exchange for steady income. I'd been targeted specifically because my freelancer financial struggles made me vulnerable to recruitment for activities that I might normally find morally unacceptable, but which could be rationalized through professional distance and economic necessity. The job listing hadn't been posted widely, but had been carefully placed where struggling freelance writers would find it, targeting people whose financial situations made them more likely to accept work without asking too many questions about client business models. When I tried to quit and report what I discovered about Meridian Content Solutions, I found that my employment contract included clauses about confidentiality and non-disclosure that made exposing their activities potentially expensive and legally complicated. The professional-looking contract I'd signed without reading carefully had included terms that protected the company from employee reporting of client activities, making it risky for me to expose harmful services I'd helped market. More concerning was discovering that some of the marketing materials I'd written had been successful enough that the harmful services were expanding their operations, using my professional copy to recruit additional clients for systematic harassment targeting Sheffield area residents. My writing had been effective enough at making harmful services seem legitimate that they were able to grow their operations and cause more extensive harm to more people in my own community. The marketing copy I'd created was continuing to generate business for services that specialized in causing psychological and professional harm to specific individuals, with my professional writing skills being used to expand the reach and effectiveness of organized harassment campaigns. I never found a safe method for extracting myself from involvement with Meridian Content Solutions, and the marketing materials I'd created continued being used to promote harmful services that were expanding their operations throughout Yorkshire. Some of the harassment services I'd helped market were probably still causing problems for people I encountered during daily activities in Sheffield. Using professional marketing copy I'd written to present systematic cruelty as legitimate technical consulting, I eventually found other copywriting work through more conventional channels, but the income was considerably lower and less stable than what Meridian had provided, making it difficult to maintain the financial stability I'd achieved through writing marketing materials for harmful services. The alternative platform clients continue operating. The systematic harassment services continue expanding their operations, and people continue experiencing professionally marketed harm, that's disguised as legitimate business consulting through marketing copy. Written by freelancers who need the income more than they need clear consciences. I still work as a freelance copywriter, still live in Sheffield, still wonder whether some of the financial and personal problems experienced by people around me might be caused by services I help to market to clients who were looking for professional ways to cause harm to specific individuals. But I'm also aware that financial desperation can be systematically exploited by people who understand that struggling freelancers will write marketing copy for almost anything if the money is good enough, and the moral implications are presented as someone else's responsibility. The perfect job that paid 3 times my previous salary turned out to be writing professional marketing materials for systematic harassment services, with my copywriting skills being used to help criminal activities seem like legitimate business consulting to clients who wanted to cause harm, but preferred to think of themselves as hiring technical experts rather than criminal services. The marketing copy I wrote continues helping harmful services recruit clients and expand their operations, while the financial stability I achieved through that work makes it difficult to report activities that I help facilitate through professional writing that made organized cruelty look like respectable business services. You know, when someone asks you for a favor and you say yes without really thinking about what you're agreeing to. That's exactly how I ended up helping my flatmate with what she claimed was university research, but turned out to be something that still makes me check my locks twice before bed. This happened about 18 months ago when I was living in Leeds with Sarah, who was doing some kind of postgraduate psychology course that seemed to involve a lot of late nights on her laptop and very little actual attendance at the university. I was working at a coffee shop and trying to figure out what to do with my life after dropping out of my English degree the year before. Sarah was always a bit secretive about her studies, but I assumed that was normal for postgrad work. She'd disappear for days sometimes, come back with expensive equipment I'd never seen before, and spend hours writing reports that she never talked about despite us being close enough that we usually shared everything. The favor she asked me was simple enough. She needed someone to help with data collection for her dissertation about online behavior patterns. Nothing complicated, just following some links she'd provide and documenting my reactions to different types of content. She'd pay me £50 for a few hours of work, which was decent money for someone living on coffee shop wages. I should have asked more questions about what kind of content I'd be looking at, but Sarah assured me it was nothing illegal or obviously disturbing, just research into how people respond to information that exists outside mainstream internet platforms, the sort of academic study that universities were always conducting about digital media and social psychology. She set me up with some software on her laptop that took ages to connect to anything, explaining that her research required accessing communities that weren't indexed by normal search engines. Academic research often needed to study spaces that weren't easily accessible to casual users, she said, to understand how information really moved through digital networks. The first few sites she directed me to were disappointing, if anything. Discussion groups about privacy rights, political communities that seemed focused on topics too controversial for mainstream social media, academic-looking resources about subjects I'd never heard of. Exactly the sort of dry, intellectual content you'd expect from university research. But as Sarah guided me through different areas of this hidden internet, the content started becoming more interesting in ways that made me uncomfortable. Not obviously illegal material, but discussions about activities that seem to operate outside normal social boundaries, communities where people shared information about accessing restricted spaces, monitoring other people's activities, and conducting research that traditional academic institutions wouldn't approve. Some groups were focused on what they called social observation, systematic documentation of how people behaved when they thought they weren't being watched. Others discussed methods for accessing private information about individuals and using that knowledge for various research purposes. Sarah explained that understanding these communities was essential for her dissertation about the psychology of privacy in digital environments. She needed to document how people justified activities that most others would consider ethically questionable, analyzing the psychological mechanisms that allowed individuals to rationalize behavior that violated social norms. The academic context made sense, and I found myself genuinely interested in the psychological questions her research was exploring. How did people convince themselves that invasion of privacy was justified? What social conditions allowed communities to develop around activities that isolated individuals would recognize as inappropriate? Over several sessions, Sarah had me explore increasingly extreme communities, always with the same academic framework about understanding psychological rationalization and social boundary violation. But I started noticing that some of the communities weren't just discussing theoretical approaches to social observation and privacy violation. They were actively sharing specific information about real people, planning activities that seemed designed to cause genuine harm rather than gather academic insights. Some participants posted detailed personal information about individuals they'd been monitoring, including photographs taken without consent, records of daily routines, and even access to private communications that had been intercepted through various technical methods. The discussions weren't academic analysis of privacy violation, but active coordination of harassment campaigns against specific targets who had been selected for reasons that weren't always clear, but seemed to involve personal grudges or systematic targeting of vulnerable individuals. When I mentioned my concerns to Sarah, she explained that documenting active harmful behavior was unfortunately necessary for understanding how these communities functioned. Her research couldn't rely only on theoretical discussions, but needed to observe actual implementation of privacy violation techniques to provide meaningful academic insights. She assured me that observing this content was contributing to research that would eventually help develop better protections for potential victims, making temporary discomfort about witnessing harmful behavior justified by the long-term benefits of understanding how digital harassment actually operated. But I also started realizing that Sarah's research methods seemed to go beyond passive observation into something that looked more like active participation in the communities we were studying. She had established relationships with regular participants, contributed information that enhanced discussions about monitoring and harassment techniques, and seemed to have access to restricted areas of these communities that suggested long-term involvement rather than recent academic research. Some of the personal information being shared about harassment targets was local to Leeds, including details about people's daily routines in areas I recognized from around the city. This wasn't abstract research into distant communities, but active documentation of potential victims who lived in our immediate area. I realized that Sarah's dissertation research might be providing cover for activities that went considerably beyond academic study into active participation in harassment campaigns against real people in our own community. When I tried to research Sarah's university course and dissertation supervisor, I discovered that the postgraduate psychology program she claimed to be enrolled in didn't exist at Leeds University, and the research she described wasn't being conducted through any legitimate academic institution. Either she was involved in research through a different institution than she'd claimed, or her activities weren't actually academic research, but something else entirely. that required the sort of systematic privacy violation and harassment coordination I'd been helping her document. I started paying closer attention to Sarah's equipment and research materials, trying to understand what kind of work she was actually conducting and whether it was connected to legitimate academic research or something more problematic. The technical setup in her room was considerably more sophisticated than typical university research would require, with equipment that seemed designed for systematic monitoring and data collection, rather than occasional academic projects. She had multiple communication devices, data storage systems that were running continuously, and networking equipment that suggested permanent installation rather than temporary research setup. Most disturbing was discovering that some of the harassment targets we'd been observing through the hidden communities were people I'd seen around Leeds, including individuals whose daily routines Sarah seemed to know with accuracy that could only come from systematic personal surveillance. I realized that the research I'd been helping with wasn't academic study of online harassment communities, but active participation in harassment activities targeting real people in our local area. Sarah wasn't a postgraduate researcher studying digital privacy violation, but someone who was using academic research as cover for participating in systematic harassment and surveillance of specific individuals she'd selected for reasons I didn't understand. My assistance with her supposed dissertation had made me complicit in activities that were causing genuine harm to people who had no idea they were being monitored and targeted by someone living in their own community. I tried to confront Sarah about what I'd discovered, but she disappeared from the flat along with all her equipment, leaving behind only the basic furniture that had been there when she'd moved in months earlier. The landlord told me she'd paid rent through the end of the lease, but hadn't provided forwarding information, suggesting she'd planned to leave suddenly once her activities in Leeds were completed. I never found out what happened to the harassment targets we'd been observing, or whether Sarah's sudden departure meant their surveillance had ended, or simply been transferred to different methods that didn't require maintaining a local residence. The hidden communities continue to operate. The systematic harassment of vulnerable individuals continues to expand, and people continue to be monitored and targeted by individuals who present their activities as legitimate research while conducting systematic violation of privacy and personal safety. I still work at the coffee shop, still live in Leeds, still wonder whether some of my customers might be involved in activities similar to what Sarah was conducting, using legitimate-sounding explanations to justify systematic harm to people who have no idea they're being watched and targeted. But I'm also aware that offers to help with academic research can be covers for activities that have nothing to do with legitimate study, and that people who need money and want to help with what sounds like important work can easily become complicit in systematic harassment disguised as scholarly investigation. The favor I did for my flatmate continues to make me uncomfortable every time I see someone who might have been one of the surveillance targets we documented, wondering whether my assistance contributed to ongoing harm that I helped facilitate without understanding what I was really agreeing to do. I shouldn't be telling you this, really. Part of me wishes I'd never gone looking in the first place, but curiosity has always been my weakness. I suppose that's why I ended up in marketing, rather than something sensible like accounting, always poking at things better left alone. It started about 18 months ago, when I was living in that bedsit in Hackney. It was a seriously grim place. Damp creeping up the walls, heating that worked when it fancied, and a landlord who responded to maintenance requests about as often as England win the World Cup. However, it was the only option I could afford given my salary. and the Wi-Fi quality was good enough, I'd been having trouble sleeping. Nothing dramatic, just lying there scrolling through my phone until 3 in the morning, reading the same news articles over and over. You know how it is when your brain won't switch off. One night, probably around 2:30, I found myself reading about the dark web. Not because I was particularly interested, mind you. It was just one of those rabbit holes you fall down when you're bored and tired. Most of it was the usual sensationalist nonsense from journalists who clearly didn't know what they were talking about. Hitmen for hire, illegal organ markets, that sort of tabloid fodder. But there was one article, buried in some obscure tech blog, that mentioned something called neighborhood watch sites, places where people could share information about their local areas that they couldn't post anywhere else. The article was vague, deliberately so, but it suggested these sites contained things like CCTV footage from private cameras, details about residents' daily routines, even photos taken through windows. All completely illegal, obviously, but the authorities couldn't do much about it because of how these sites operated. I should have closed my laptop and gone to sleep. Instead, I spent the next week teaching myself how to access these hidden parts of the internet. It's not as complicated as people make out. Mostly just downloading different software and following instructions you can find anywhere online. The hard part is knowing where to look once you're there. It took me nearly a fortnight to find one of these neighborhood watch sites. They're not advertised, obviously. You have to know someone who knows someone, or stumble across a link in some forgotten corner of a message board. When I finally found one, I almost backed out immediately. The whole thing felt grubby, voyeuristic in the worst possible way. But I was curious about my own area. Hackney's not exactly leafy Surrey. There's always something happening. Police sirens most nights, the occasional bit of excitement. I wondered what secrets my neighbors might be keeping, what the people in the flats above and below got up to when they thought nobody was watching. The site was surprisingly professional looking. Clean white background, simple navigation, no pop-up adverts or flashing graphics. It could have been a local council website except for the content. There were sections for different London boroughs, then subsections for specific areas. I clicked on Hackney, then narrowed it down to my postcode. The first few posts were fairly mundane. Someone had uploaded photos of teenagers hanging about outside the chicken shop on my road, claiming they were dealing drugs. Another post showed a man in his 50s walking his dog at unusual hours, with speculation about what he might be up to. Petty neighborhood paranoia, the sort of thing you'd expect from curtain twitchers with too much time on their hands. Then I saw my building. It was just a photograph at first, taken from across the street at night. My bedsit was on the first floor, and you could see the blue glow from my laptop screen through the thin curtains. The image quality was surprisingly good. Someone had used a proper camera with a decent lens. The timestamp showed it had been taken 3 days earlier, around the time I'd been researching these very websites. The post didn't mention me specifically, but the comments underneath were unsettling. People discussing which flat was which, what times the lights went on and off, who had visitors and when. Someone had even worked out roughly how many people lived in each unit, based on the different types of curtains and the patterns of activity they'd observed. I should have logged off then, deleted the software, forgotten the whole thing, but something made me keep scrolling. Maybe it was the realization that I'd been watched without knowing it. Or maybe I just wanted to understand how deep this surveillance went. The next post made my stomach drop. It was a collection of photographs taken from the alleyway behind my building. The back windows of the ground floor flats were clearly visible, and someone had catalogued which rooms were bedrooms, which were kitchens, even which tenants appeared to live alone. The photos had been taken over several weeks, building up a comprehensive picture of everyone's routines. But it was the final image in that post that made me close my laptop and walk away from the desk. It showed the back of my building at night, but this time there was a figure visible in one of the windows, a silhouette of someone standing very still, looking out into the darkness. The timestamp was from the previous evening. I'd been out that night, at my mate Dave's birthday drinks in Shoreditch. My flat should have been empty. I told myself it must have been a reflection, or maybe the image had been taken on a different night, and the timestamp was wrong. But when I checked my building the next morning, I noticed something I'd never paid attention to before. The fire escape at the back led directly past my kitchen window, and the lock on the back door looked like it had been tampered with. That evening, I moved my desk away from the front window and started keeping the curtains closed. I also began checking the dark website more regularly, telling myself it was just sensible precaution. If someone was watching my building, I wanted to know about it. The post continued. More photographs, more detailed observations about the residents' habits. Someone had even uploaded footage from what looked like a security camera, showing people coming and going from the front entrance. I recognized several of my neighbors, including the woman from the flat below, who always seemed to be arguing with someone on her phone. Then the post started getting more specific. Someone uploaded a close-up photograph of my kitchen window, taken from the fire escape. You could see right inside, my dirty dishes in the sink, a shopping list stuck to the fridge, even the corner of my sofa visible through the doorway. The photo was time-stamped from the previous afternoon when I'd been at work. The comments under that post were worse than the image itself. People discussing the best times to access the fire escape, speculating about whether I had any security cameras, even debating whether I kept my spare key hidden somewhere outside. One comment mentioned that I appeared to live alone and suggested this made me an easier target. I started coming home from work different ways each day, checking the alleyway before entering my building. I bought a cheap security camera for my kitchen window, though I wasn't sure it would do much good. Mostly, I tried to convince myself this was all just internet weirdos playing at being spies, harmless voyeurs with nothing better to do. But the photographs kept coming. Someone had taken pictures of me through my bathroom window. Just my silhouette, thankfully, but clear enough to identify me. Another post showed my morning routine, captured through the gap in my bedroom curtains. Times when I left for work, what I wore, which direction I walked to the tube station. The worst part wasn't the invasion of privacy, though that was horrible enough. It was the realization that multiple people were involved. The photographs came from different angles, different cameras, different times of day. This wasn't one obsessed stalker. It was a group of people, possibly several dozen, all systematically documenting the lives of everyone in my area. I considered calling the police, but what would I tell them? That I'd found illegal surveillance photographs while browsing illegal websites. That strangers on the internet were taking pictures of my building. They'd either think I was paranoid or ask uncomfortable questions about how I discovered the images in the first place. Instead, I started looking at other areas on the site. Maybe this was just something that happened in my particular corner of Hackney, an unfortunate coincidence of geography and opportunity. But no, there were sections for Islington, Camden, Southwark, even some of the posher areas like Kensington and Chelsea. Thousands of photographs, hundreds of posts, all documenting the private lives of ordinary people who had no idea they were being watched. Some of the posts were worse than others. I found images of children playing in their gardens, elderly people getting undressed with their curtains open, couples having arguments in their kitchens, all uploaded without consent, shared between strangers, commented on like they were characters in some twisted reality show. The site had a section for requests too, people asking for specific information about particular addresses, offering to trade photographs of their own neighborhoods in exchange for surveillance from other areas. Some of the requests were chillingly specific, asking for details about women living alone or wanting to know the routines of families with young children. I found myself checking the site obsessively, looking for new posts about my building. Part of me hoped the interest would move elsewhere, that whoever was taking these photographs would get bored and focus on someone else. But the posts kept coming, getting more detailed and invasive each time. One morning, I woke up to find a new photograph that made me physically sick. It showed my bedroom window from outside, taken sometime during the night while I was sleeping. But this image wasn't taken from ground level or even from another building. The angle suggested someone had been on the fire escape right outside my window, close enough to see inside despite the curtains being mostly closed. The timestamp showed 3 a.m. I'd been asleep, completely vulnerable, while someone had climbed the fire escape and stood just meters away from where I lay. The thought of it made my hands shake as I scrolled through the comments underneath. People discussing how easy it would be to force the window, speculating about whether I kept anything valuable in my bedroom, even suggesting what they might do if they could get inside. That's when I knew I had to move, not just to a different flat, but out of London entirely. These people, whoever they were, had turned surveillance into a hobby. They were organized, systematic, and apparently untouchable. The police couldn't stop them because they operated in the shadows of the internet, sharing information through channels most people didn't even know existed. I handed in my notice at work the following week and moved back in with my parents in Gloucestershire. Told them I needed a change of scene, wanted to save some money, that sort of thing. They didn't ask too many questions, which I was grateful for. How do you explain that you've discovered an entire community of people dedicated to watching strangers through their windows? But even now, 6 months later, and nearly 200 miles away, I still check that website sometimes. I tell myself it's just to make sure they're not still posting about my old building. But really, it's become a compulsion. I need to know how bad it's getting, how many more people they're watching. The site's grown since I left London. New sections for other cities, more sophisticated organization, better cameras and clearer images. They've started using drones too. I've seen aerial photographs of people in their gardens who clearly have no idea they're being watched from above. Sometimes I wonder if they know I used to look at their site, whether they've somehow tracked me down to this small market town where nothing interesting ever happens. I keep the curtains closed most of the time now, even during the day. I've started checking the locks twice before bed and looking over my shoulder when I walk down quiet streets. Because the thing that really bothers me, the thing that keeps me awake at night, is how ordinary these watchers seem to be. They're not criminal masterminds or dangerous extremists. They're just people who've discovered they can spy on their neighbors with almost complete impunity, and they've decided that other people's privacy doesn't matter as much as their own entertainment. They could be anywhere. Your neighbor's the person sitting across from you on the bus, someone walking their dog past your house every evening. All it takes is a decent camera, a willingness to ignore basic human decency, and access to a website that the authorities can't seem to shut down. I still get nightmares about that silhouette in my kitchen window, the one from that first photograph. Someone standing in my flat while I was out, going through my things, maybe even waiting for me to come home. I never did work out who it was or how they got in, but sometimes in the small hours of the morning when sleep won't come. I wonder if they're still out there, still watching, still waiting, just not from inside my flat anymore. You'd think that winning a competition you never entered would be exciting, but when the prize is something you never wanted and the competition involves skills you didn't know you possessed, it becomes the sort of experience that makes you question whether some opportunities are actually traps, disguised as good fortune. This started about 10 months ago when I was working as a primary school teaching assistant, helping Year 3 students with reading comprehension while trying to save enough money to complete my teaching qualification. I was 28 and living in a shared house with 2 other women who worked at the local hospital, content with a simple routine that involved work, evening classes, and weekend visits to my parents in nearby Burton. The letter that changed everything arrived on a Thursday morning, printed on expensive paper with a logo I didn't recognize, informing me that I'd been selected as the winner of something called the Digital Literacy Assessment Challenge. According to the letter, I demonstrated exceptional analytical skills during an online evaluation that had been conducted without my knowledge, identifying patterns and drawing conclusions that place me in the top percentile of participants nationwide. The prize was a laptop computer and a £500 Amazon voucher, which seemed generous for a competition I couldn't remember entering. But the letter included screenshots of responses I'd apparently provided to various online questionnaires and puzzle challenges, showing analysis that was considerably more sophisticated than anything I remembered doing. The screenshots looked authentic and were definitely written in my communication style, but they discussed topics I knew nothing about and demonstrated problem-solving approaches that seemed beyond my actual capabilities. I assumed there had been some kind of administrative error, but when I contacted the organization behind the competition, they insisted their records were accurate and that my analytical performance had been genuinely impressive. They explained that the Digital Literacy Assessment Challenge had been conducted through routine internet activities rather than formal testing, analyzing how people naturally approached information processing and pattern recognition during normal online browsing. My responses to various websites, social media platforms, and even online shopping decisions had apparently demonstrated analytical thinking that was particularly valuable for certain types of digital research projects. The competition had been designed to identify individuals with specific cognitive strengths who might be interested in participating in advanced research activities that required sophisticated analytical capabilities. They offered additional opportunities for paid research participation if I was interested in using my analytical skills for projects that weren't available to the general public, but which could provide substantial financial compensation for the right candidates. The initial research project they described sounded straightforward, analyzing online communities and social dynamics using skills I'd apparently demonstrated during the competition evaluation. The work would be conducted remotely and would pay significantly more than my teaching assistant salary. I was curious about what analytical skills I'd supposedly demonstrated, and the financial opportunity was appealing given my student debt and career development expenses. I agreed to participate in the initial research project to see what was involved. The research materials they provided required special software that allowed access to online communities that weren't part of mainstream internet platforms. They explained that understanding digital social dynamics required studying how people behaved in various types of online environments, including spaces that operated outside conventional social media systems. The first communities they directed me to study were academic in nature, discussion groups focused on complex political theories, philosophical debates about ethics and social responsibility, even collaborative problem-solving communities where participants work together on challenging intellectual puzzles. My role was to analyze communication patterns, identify influential community members, and document how information spread through these networks. The work required the sort of detailed pattern recognition and social analysis that apparently made me suitable for the research project. I found myself genuinely engaged with the analytical challenges, discovering that I had stronger observational skills than I'd realized and could identify subtle social dynamics that weren't immediately obvious to casual observers. The research supervisors were impressed with my analysis and gradually provided access to more complex communities that required deeper analytical expertise to understand properly. Some of these communities were focused on activities that seemed ethically questionable, sharing personal information about strangers, coordinating harassment campaigns, even planning activities that appeared to be designed to cause psychological harm to specific individuals. When I expressed concern about analyzing communities whose activities seemed harmful, the research supervisors explained that understanding problematic online behavior was essential for developing better digital safety measures and protecting potential victims. They assured me that my analysis was contributing to protective research rather than facilitating harmful activities, helping identify warning signs and intervention points that could be used to prevent digital harassment before it escalated into serious harm. The academic framework made sense, and I was genuinely interested in contributing to research that might help protect people from online harassment and digital manipulation. But as I continued analyzing these communities, I started noticing that some participants were discussing activities that involved people in Derbyshire, including detailed information about individuals who lived and worked in areas I recognized from around Derby and Burton. The communities weren't focused on abstract or distant harassment targets, but were actively planning activities that would affect real people in my immediate geographic area. Some discussions included enough specific detail about local individuals that I began to worry I might recognize the targets if I encountered them during normal daily activities around Derby. When I reported these local connections to my research supervisors, they seemed particularly interested in my ability to identify geographic and social context that other analysts had missed. They explained that having researchers with local knowledge was valuable for understanding how online harassment translated into real-world impact, and asked if I could provide additional context about the local references I'd identified. The research assignment was shifting from analyzing online behavior to providing intelligence about my own community, but the academic justification made this feel like natural progression rather than ethical boundary violation. I agreed to provide local context for the harassment activities I was analyzing, telling myself this was contributing to protective research that would ultimately help potential victims rather than facilitating harm. But as I provided more detailed information about Derby area locations, businesses, and social networks, I realized that my local knowledge was being used to enhance the effectiveness of harassment campaigns rather than protect people from them. The communities I was analyzing weren't theoretical research subjects, but active harassment groups that were using my analysis to improve their targeting and coordination of real harm against specific individuals in my own community. My analytical skills hadn't been identified through a legitimate competition, but through systematic observation of my online activities by people who were looking for individuals with specific capabilities that would be useful for enhancing their harassment techniques. The research project wasn't academic study of digital social dynamics, but recruitment for providing analytical support to groups that specialized in systematic psychological torture of selected targets. I tried to stop participating in the research, but discovered that my involvement had already provided enough local intelligence to make withdrawal complicated without risking exposure of activities that I'd inadvertently supported. The research supervisors made it clear that my analytical contributions had been valuable enough that they preferred continued cooperation rather than dealing with complications that might arise if I attempted to expose their activities. They suggested that ongoing participation in research projects would be considerably less problematic than attempting to report activities that I'd already provided substantial analytical support for implementing. The implication was clear. I'd become complicit in harassment activities through my analytical work, making it dangerous for me to attempt withdrawal or exposure without facing potential consequences for my own involvement. I continued providing analytical support while trying to understand the scope of what I'd gotten involved in and whether there were safe methods for extracting myself from activities that I now understood were causing genuine harm to real people. The research projects expanded to include analysis of additional communities and coordination of more sophisticated harassment campaigns, with my local knowledge being used to enhance targeting of Derby area residents who had been selected for systematic psychological manipulation. Some targets were individuals whose daily routines I'd observed during normal activities, making me realize that my analytical work was directly contributing to harassment of people I encountered regularly in my own community. The psychological impact of knowing that my analysis was being used to cause suffering to neighbors and strangers was considerable, but the implied threats about consequences of withdrawal made escape seem impossible without risking serious personal repercussions. I realized that the competition I'd supposedly won had been a recruitment trap designed to identify people with analytical capabilities who could be manipulated into providing support for harassment activities through academic justification and financial incentives. The analytical skills I demonstrated hadn't been exceptional individual capabilities, but had been artificially enhanced through careful presentation of information and systematic manipulation of my responses to create the impression of expertise that would justify recruitment for specialized activities. Other people in Derby and surrounding areas were probably experiencing harassment that was being enhanced by analysis I'd provided, while believing their problems were random misfortune rather than systematic targeting, facilitated by unwitting local intelligence. The communities I'd been studying continued expanding their harassment activities while refining their recruitment techniques based on analysis of how people like me could be persuaded to provide support for activities we would normally find morally unacceptable. About 6 months after my initial recruitment, I received information that made the true scope of their activities clear. Rather than being one of many analytical researchers working on separate projects, I'd been the primary intelligence source for harassment activities affecting dozens of people throughout Derbyshire, with my local knowledge providing the geographic and social context that made systematic targeting possible. The harassment campaigns I'd been analyzing weren't just research subjects for academic study, but active operations that were causing genuine psychological harm to real individuals who'd been selected based partly on intelligence I'd provided about local vulnerabilities and social networks. My analytical contributions hadn't been supporting protective research, but had been essential infrastructure for harassment activities that would have been impossible without local intelligence, from someone with my community knowledge and analytical capabilities. The people conducting these harassment activities had invested months in recruiting and manipulating me specifically, because they needed analytical support from someone with legitimate community connections who could provide intelligence while believing they were contributing to protective research. I'd been selected not because of exceptional analytical skills revealed through a competition, but because my profile as a local education worker with financial motivations and strong ethical instincts made me an ideal target for manipulation into providing support for activities I would never knowingly facilitate. The recruitment process had been tailored to my specific psychological vulnerabilities and ethical reasoning patterns, using academic justification and gradual escalation to overcome my normal moral resistance to systematic harassment. I never found a safe method for extracting myself from involvement in these activities, and the harassment campaigns I'd supported continued expanding while incorporating intelligence I'd provided about local community dynamics and individual vulnerabilities. I still work as a teaching assistant, still live in Derby, still encounter people who may be experiencing harassment that was enhanced by analysis I provided, while believing I was contributing to protective research rather than facilitating systematic psychological torture. But I'm also aware that analytical capabilities can be systematically exploited by people who understand how to present harmful activities as legitimate research, and that good intentions can be weaponized by individuals who specialize in recruiting well-meaning people for activities they would never choose to support if they understood the true consequences of their involvement. The test I thought I'd pass by winning a competition I'd never entered turned out to be evaluation for recruitment into activities that treat systematic harassment as entertainment, with my analytical skills being used to enhance the suffering of real people in my own community, while I believed I was contributing to academic research designed to protect potential victims from digital manipulation. My neighbor asked me to help find her missing cat, but when I started looking into where lost pets actually end up, I discovered a trade that made me wish I'd just minded my own business. Mrs. Henderson from 3 doors down knocked on my door on a rainy Thursday morning, clearly distraught about her tabby cat Jasper, who hadn't come home for 2 days. She'd already put up posters around our neighborhood and called the local animal shelters, but wanted to try online searches as well, since she wasn't comfortable with computers. It seemed like a simple favor. Help an elderly neighbor search Facebook, lost pet groups, and maybe browse some classified sites to see if anyone had found a cat matching Jasper's description. I've always been fond of cats myself, and Mrs. Henderson had been nothing but kind since I'd moved into the street 18 months earlier. We started with the obvious places: local Facebook groups, Gumtree, the usual spots where people post about found animals. No luck with Jasper specifically, but I was struck by how many cats went missing in our area. There were numerous messages from anxious pet owners featuring images of cherished animals that had mysteriously disappeared. Mrs. Henderson mentioned that several other cats in the neighborhood had disappeared over the past few months, which I'd noticed but hadn't thought much about. Cats wander off sometimes, get hit by cars, or find new homes where they prefer the food. It happens, but the sheer volume of missing cat posts made me curious about what actually happens to pets that disappear. I started following links from pet recovery websites, hoping to understand the process better and maybe find more effective ways to track down Jasper. That's when I stumbled across classified advertisements that made my stomach turn. Some people sell cats and dogs without asking questions about their origins, often using hastily taken photos and deliberately vague descriptions of the animals' backgrounds. Some ads were clearly legitimate. People rehoming pets due to allergies or housing changes. But others had a different quality that made me suspicious. Multiple animals listed by the same sellers, prices that seemed either suspiciously low or unexpectedly high, and pickup arrangements that avoided normal pet ownership verification. By following these advertisements, I was able to delve deeper into online marketplaces that were not easily accessible through traditional search engines. Sites where animals were traded with even less oversight and documentation than the questionable classified ads I'd already found. The deeper I went, the more disturbing the trade became. Animals being sold for purposes that clearly weren't legitimate pet ownership. Research laboratories that operated outside normal ethical guidelines. Individuals who wanted animals for activities they couldn't discuss openly, and what appeared to be systematic collection and redistribution of pets that had been taken from their original homes. I realized that missing pets weren't just wandering off or meeting unfortunate accidents. Many were being systematically stolen and funneled into underground markets, where they were sold for purposes their original owners would never have consented to. The neighborhood cat disappearances that Mrs. Henderson had mentioned weren't coincidences. Someone was deliberately targeting our area, taking pets that were then sold through networks that operated with minimal oversight or accountability. But understanding what was happening to missing cats didn't immediately help me find Jasper or provide useful information to share with Mrs. Henderson without explaining how I'd discovered these disturbing markets. I tried to research whether law enforcement was aware of systematic pet theft operations, hoping to find legitimate channels for reporting what I'd discovered without having to admit to browsing illegal animal trading platforms. What I found was that pet theft was increasingly common but difficult to prosecute, since proving that animals had been stolen rather than simply lost required evidence that was rarely available when pets disappeared from familiar neighborhoods. The underground animal trade operated with sophisticated methods for avoiding detection, using the natural mobility of pets and the emotional distress of their owners to mask systematic criminal operations that generated substantial profits through exploitation of the human-animal bond. But most disturbing was discovering that the pet trade was just one part of larger networks that specialized in acquiring and redistributing living creatures for various illegal purposes, with cats and dogs being treated as renewable resources that could be systematically harvested from residential areas. The casual way these markets operated suggested that pet theft was routine business, with professional networks that understood how to identify vulnerable targets, execute efficient collection operations, and distribute animals through channels that avoided law enforcement detection. Meanwhile, Mrs. Henderson was probably continuing to search for Jasper through conventional methods, unaware that her beloved pet might have been deliberately taken and sold to people whose intentions she couldn't have imagined. The neighborhood cats that had disappeared over recent months had probably followed similar paths, ending up in situations that their original families would never discover and couldn't have prevented without understanding the systematic nature of the threat. But reporting what I'd learned would require explaining how I'd accessed these underground markets, potentially making me appear complicit in illegal activities while failing to provide actionable intelligence that could help recover specific missing animals. The pet theft operations were probably continuing to target our neighborhood and others, with new animals being taken regularly while maintaining the appearance that pets were simply wandering off or meeting accidental fates. I eventually told Mrs. Henderson that my online searches hadn't found any traces of Jasper, which was technically true since I discovered the probable fate of missing cats without finding specific evidence of what had happened to her pet. But I also quietly started keeping my own cat indoors permanently and mentioned to other neighbors that they might want to be more careful about letting their pets roam freely, without explaining the specific reasons for my increased caution. The missing cat search that was supposed to help a neighbor had instead revealed systematic criminal operations that made the entire neighborhood feel less safe, not just for pets, but for anyone who could be systematically targeted by people who understood how to identify and exploit vulnerabilities. Mrs. Henderson never found Jasper, and over the following months, several more cats disappeared from our street, despite increased vigilance from owners who were becoming aware that something more than natural wandering was affecting the local pet population. But the underground markets I discovered were probably still operating, continuing to facilitate the trade in stolen animals while maintaining the anonymity and discretion that allowed them to function without interference from law enforcement or animal welfare organizations. Every time I saw a new missing pet poster in the neighborhood, I wondered whether the owner would ever discover what had really happened to their beloved companion, or whether they'd simply join the growing number of people who had lost pets to criminal operations they never knew existed. I need to tell someone about this, even if it makes me sound paranoid or insane. Maybe especially if it does. What happened wasn't supernatural or impossible. That's what makes it worse. Everything I'm about to describe could happen to anyone, and that's the thought that keeps me awake most nights now. I suppose I should start by explaining how I ended up on the dark web in the first place. It wasn't for anything dramatic or illegal. No drugs, no stolen credit cards, nothing like that. The truth is almost embarrassingly mundane. I was bored and curious. That combination has probably ruined more lives than any deliberate malice ever could. I'd been working remotely for about 18 months, doing content writing for various marketing agencies, the kind of work where you churn out blog posts about dental hygiene and insurance policies, trying to make the supremely dull sound vaguely interesting. My flat in Manchester was small, affordable, and utterly soul-destroying in its beige uniformity. Most days I'd wake up, make coffee, sit at my desk, and not speak to another human being until I went to bed again. The isolation does something to you after a while. You start looking for connection in strange places, start convincing yourself that the internet's darker corners must be more interesting than your reality. I'd read about the dark web for years, obviously, everyone has. The usual sensationalist rubbish in newspapers, the occasional documentary that makes it all seem impossibly sinister and complex. But I'd also stumbled across more measured articles explaining that most of it was fairly boring. Political dissidents communicating safely, whistleblowers, people in oppressive countries, accessing uncensored information. That aspect actually appealed to me. I liked the idea of an internet that wasn't entirely corporate, where algorithms weren't constantly trying to sell me things or predict my behavior. Getting access wasn't particularly difficult. I'm not technically minded, can barely troubleshoot my own Wi-Fi when it acts up. But there are guides everywhere if you know where to look. Took me maybe an afternoon to get everything sorted. And then I was there. The hidden internet, the dark web, the place parents warn their children about. And God, was it disappointing at first. Mostly, it looked like websites from 1998, all text-based and clunky. Forums discussing privacy rights and encryption. Marketplaces that were obviously dodgy, but presented themselves with this bizarre corporate professionalism, complete with customer service policies and user ratings. I spent hours just clicking around, reading things not really engaging. It felt like wandering through a massive, dimly lit car boot sale, where everyone was trying very hard to look mysterious and dangerous, but mostly just seemed a bit sad. I didn't buy anything, didn't sell anything, didn't even create accounts on most of the sites I visited. I was a tourist, essentially. A spectator. That's what I kept telling myself anyway. For about 3 months, this became my evening routine. Finish work, make dinner, spend a few hours exploring. I found forums dedicated to incredibly niche topics, people discussing conspiracy theories I'd never heard of, groups sharing banned books, communities built around philosophical ideas that conventional society had rejected. Some of it was genuinely interesting. Most of it was rubbish. All of it felt illicit in a way that was mildly thrilling without being genuinely risky. Then I found the invitation board. It wasn't called that officially. The site had some pretentious Latin name I've since forgotten. But essentially, it was a message board where people posted invitations to private sites deeper in the network. Most of them were obvious scams or honeypots. Exclusive investment opportunities, definitely fraud. Premium content access, probably illegal pornography or worse. I scrolled past those without a second thought. I might have been bored, but I wasn't stupid. But occasionally there'd be invitations that seemed more legitimate, isn't the right word. More intriguing, maybe. Invitations to private discussion groups about art or philosophy. Invitations to closed networks where journalists and activists coordinated. One person was even trying to organize an anonymous book club, which I found oddly charming. The invitation that caught my attention was simple. Just a few lines of text. Looking for people who feel disconnected, not selling anything, not asking for anything. Just want to talk to others who understand what it's like to be lonely in a crowded world. If you're tired of performing for an audience, tired of curating yourself, maybe we can just be honest for a while. Limited spaces. Below it was a link and a passcode. I stared at that message for a long time. It felt like it had been written specifically for me, which I recognized as exactly the response it was designed to provoke. Anyone feeling isolated and aimless would read those words and think, yes, that's exactly how I feel. It was manipulative in its specificity. But I clicked anyway. The link took me to what looked like a private chat room. Very basic interface, just a black screen with green text. There were maybe 8 or 9 people in there when I joined, all using anonymous handles. Nobody said hello or acknowledged my arrival. They were mid-conversation, discussing whether genuine human connection was even possible anymore, or whether we'd all become too fractured, too performative, too aware of ourselves. I lurked for about 20 minutes, just reading. The conversation was surprisingly thoughtful. No trolling, no aggression. Just people being remarkably honest about their loneliness and dissatisfaction. Someone talked about how they'd realized they didn't actually like any of their friends. They just went through the motions of friendship because the alternative was being completely alone. Someone else described the feeling of being hollow, like they were just a collection of responses and reactions with nothing genuine underneath. Eventually, I started typing. Nothing profound, just agreeing with something someone had said about how exhausting it was to constantly maintain a persona. The response was immediate and warm. Several people welcomed me, said they were glad I joined, asked gentle questions about my life. We talked for hours that night, about loneliness, about meaning, about whether happiness was even a realistic goal, or just something we'd been conditioned to pursue. It sounds pretentious written down like this, but in the moment it felt significant. These people understood something about the world that my real-life acquaintances didn't, or maybe they were just willing to admit it. I went back the next night, and the night after. Within a week, I was spending 3 or 4 hours there every evening. The group stayed small, never more than a dozen people, and we began to recognize each other's writing styles, our particular preoccupations. A woman who I mentally nicknamed Red talked endlessly about how she felt like she was disappearing, becoming less real every day. Someone called Vertex was obsessed with the idea that modern life was designed to make us miserable, that every system and structure was built to generate just enough hope to keep us participating while ensuring we never actually achieve satisfaction. Dark stuff, but articulated with real intelligence. I became closer with a user called Morton, He was the one who'd posted the original invitation, though I didn't realize that until later. His messages were always thoughtful, always asked good questions. He had this way of making you feel heard that was intoxicating when you'd spent months barely speaking to anyone. We started having longer one-on-one conversations, separate from the main group. He asked about my life. I told him about the content writing, the isolation, the feeling that I was just drifting through my 20s without purpose or direction. He shared similar stories, a job he hated, a city he felt trapped in, the sense that everyone around him was pretending life made sense when clearly it didn't. After a few weeks, he asked if I'd be interested in something more substantial. The main chat room was fine, he said, but it was still just talk. Just people complaining into the void, achieving nothing. He was part of a smaller group, he explained. People who wanted to actually do something about their disconnection. Not anything dramatic or illegal, he assured me. Just experiments in authentic living. Ways to break out of the numbing routines that were slowly killing us all. I should have been suspicious. I should have asked more questions. But I was so desperate for something real, something that mattered, that I just said yes. He sent me another link, another passcode. This new space was different. Only 4 people besides Morton and myself. The conversations were more intense, more personal. We were encouraged to share details about our actual lives, no real names or identifying information, but specifics about our daily routines, our fears, our homes. The idea, as Morton explained it, was that we needed to be truly vulnerable with each other before we could move forward together. It felt like therapy almost, confessional. I told these strangers things I'd never told anyone, about how some days I didn't leave my flat at all, didn't even open the curtains, about how I'd sometimes catch myself in the mirror and barely recognize the person looking back, about the persistent, low-level terror that I'd wasted my life and it was too late to do anything about it. They responded with similar confessions. Red talked about her habit of shoplifting, not because she needed anything, but because it was the only time she felt real. Vertex described elaborate fantasies about abandoning his life entirely, just walking away from his flat and his job and becoming nobody. Another member, someone who went by Cypher, admitted to following strangers sometimes, learning their routines, imagining what their lives were like. That should have been a warning sign, that last one especially. But in the context of this group, where we were all confessing our darkest thoughts, it just seemed like more honesty, more vulnerability. Morton suggested we do an exercise. Each of us would make a small change to our routine, something that broke our normal pattern. Nothing illegal or harmful, just something unexpected. Then we'd report back about how it felt. I changed my walking route to the corner shop, started going at odd hours, 3 in the morning sometimes, when the streets were empty and everything felt slightly unreal. It was stupid, but it did make me feel something. Made the familiar streets of my neighborhood seem new and strange. The others reported similar experiences. Red started talking to strangers on public transport. Vertex began leaving his flat unlocked during the day. Cypher started recording videos of himself, monologues about his life, and leaving them playing on his laptop screen while he went out. It sounds insane now, writing it all down, but at the time it felt like progress, like we were taking control of our lives in small ways. Then Morton suggested something bigger. He said we'd reached a point where we trusted each other completely, where we understood each other. And he wanted to propose an experiment in radical honesty and trust. Each of us would share our real address, not our names, not any other identifying details, just our addresses. And then, at some point over the next month, One of us would visit one of the others unannounced, just show up at their door. The idea, he explained, was to force a moment of genuine human connection. No hiding behind screens, no carefully curated responses. Just two people who truly understood each other's loneliness, meeting face to face. It would be uncomfortable, yes, maybe even frightening. But wasn't that the point? Wasn't real connection supposed to be frightening? I can't properly explain why I agreed to this. Part of me knew it was insane. But another part, the part that had been isolated and lonely for so long, desperately wanted to believe this could be meaningful, that these people actually understood me, that this could be the start of something real. So I shared my address. We all did. 6 addresses, scattered across England. Manchester, Leeds, Brighton, London, Birmingham, Newcastle. We posted them in the chat, and Morton said that was it. The experiment had begun any day now, any time. One of us might get a visitor, or we might be the visitor ourselves. The waiting was terrible. Every noise in the corridor outside my flat made me freeze. Every time I went to the shops, I found myself scanning faces, wondering if Red or Vertex or Cypher might be there. Watching me, I stopped sleeping properly, started keeping a knife in my bedside drawer, even though I knew how ridiculous that was. A week passed. Nothing happened. 2 weeks. Still nothing. I went back to the chat room regularly, but Morton had gone quiet. So had Cypher. The others still chatted occasionally, but the energy had changed. We were all waiting, all anxious, and it poisoned the conversations. Red eventually admitted she regretted sharing her address, asked if we could just call the whole thing off. Vertex agreed. I agreed, but Morton didn't respond. On day 19, I got home from a rare trip to the shops to find my front door open. Not broken, not forced, just open, unlocked. I stood in the corridor for a long time, trying to decide what to do. Call the police, go inside, run. Eventually, I pushed the door open and stepped into my flat. Everything looked normal. Nothing obviously stolen or disturbed. My laptop was still on my desk. My television was still on the wall. I checked every room, every cupboard, under the bed, behind the shower curtain. Nothing. Nobody. But someone had been there. Someone had been in my flat while I was out. Someone had opened my door, or had a key, or picked the lock, and had been inside, touching my things, breathing my air. I found it, eventually, after nearly an hour of searching. On my laptop, a new folder on the desktop, just labeled with my address. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them, of me, leaving my flat, walking to the shops, sitting in the window of a cafe I sometimes went to, standing outside in the early morning hours during my routine breaking walks. Some were from weeks ago, from before I'd even shared my address. Someone had been watching me the entire time. And at the bottom of the folder, one final image, a photograph of my front door taken from inside my flat, taken based on the light coming through the window, earlier that same day while I'd been out. Below the image, a text file, just one sentence. We understand your loneliness now. I didn't sleep in my flat that night, stayed at a hotel, paid cash, didn't tell anyone where I was going. Called the police the next morning, but what could I tell them? That I'd met people on the dark web and invited them into my life? That I'd voluntarily shared my address with strangers? The officer was sympathetic, but pointed out that no crime had technically been committed. Someone had photographs of me in public spaces, legal. Someone had entered my flat but hadn't stolen or damaged anything. Hard to prove, impossible to investigate. I changed my locks, changed my routine, stopped going on the dark web entirely. But the fear didn't leave, because here's what I realized. Lying awake in that hotel room, staring at the ceiling, everything Morton had asked us to share, every vulnerability we'd confessed, every detail about our lives, it wasn't about connection, it was about access. It was about learning our patterns, our fears, our weaknesses. And the photographs proved they'd been watching me long before I shared my address, which meant they'd found me through the original chat room, somehow traced me through my connection, or my writing style, or something I'd carelessly mentioned. I thought I was being anonymous, but I'd been visible the entire time. I moved to a different city 3 months later. Different flat, different job, different routines. I tell people I just fancied a change. Nobody questions it, but I still find myself checking over my shoulder sometimes. Still freeze when I see someone taking photographs on their phone. Still wonder whether Morton and the others are still out there, still watching, still collecting their little experiments in loneliness and vulnerability. The worst part isn't the fear though. The worst part is that some small broken piece of me still misses those conversations, still remembers what it felt like to be understood, even if that understanding was being weaponized against me. That's what loneliness does to you. Makes you vulnerable in ways you don't even recognize until it's too late. Makes you trade safety for the illusion of connection. Makes you open doors that should stay locked. I never found out what happened to the others, whether they got visits too, whether they moved away, whether they're still out there somewhere, waiting for a knock on their door that might never come. Or maybe Morton was one of them. Maybe Red or Vertex or Cypher was him all along, playing multiple roles, manufacturing the illusion of community to make us trust him. I'll never know. All I know is that I was so desperate to feel less alone that I invited monsters into my life and called them friends. And now I'm alone anyway, but afraid as well, which is probably what they wanted all along. Have you ever wondered what would happen if someone decided to destroy your life as a hobby? Because that's basically what happened to me last year, and I'm still not entirely sure why I was chosen, or how they managed to turn my entire existence into what felt like a carefully orchestrated nightmare. It started with small things that seemed like coincidences at the time. I was 26 and working as a freelance graphic designer in Brighton, living in a studio flat above a bakery and scraping by on logo designs for local businesses while trying to build something resembling a sustainable career. The first weird thing was getting a parking ticket for a car I didn't own, parked outside my building on a Tuesday morning when I was definitely inside working on a branding project for a yoga studio. I called the council to explain the mistake, but they insisted their record showed I was the registered owner of a blue Ford Focus that I'd never seen in my life. Then my Netflix account started showing viewing history for programs I'd never watched. Documentaries about serial killers, foreign films with subtitles, reality shows that I wouldn't normally choose. When I changed my password, the strange viewing activity stopped for about a week before starting up again with different content. My Amazon account began ordering items that I didn't need and couldn't return because they were being delivered to an address I'd supposedly provided but had never lived at. Random things like kitchen equipment, books about home improvement, even clothing in sizes that didn't fit me. Each incident individually seemed like a technical glitch or identity mix-up that could happen to anyone in the digital age. But collectively, they started feeling like someone was systematically interfering with my online accounts and official records. I spent hours on customer service calls trying to sort out these problems, explaining to increasingly skeptical representatives that I wasn't responsible for activities that were clearly connected to my personal information, but which I definitely hadn't initiated. The explanations got more difficult when the problems started affecting my work. Clients would email asking about changes to projects that I hadn't made, complaining about missed deadlines for work I'd never agreed to do, even requesting refunds for services that weren't in my normal pricing structure. My professional reputation started suffering as clients lost confidence in my reliability and communication skills, despite me having no idea why they thought I was failing to meet commitments I'd never made. Then I started receiving messages from people claiming I'd contacted them about various services, photography sessions, consulting work, even personal meetings that I definitely hadn't arranged. Strangers would show up at the bakery looking for me, confused when I explained I'd never spoken to them before. It became clear that someone was impersonating me online, conducting business and social activities using my identity, while I was completely unaware these interactions were happening. I tried researching identity theft protection and recovery methods, but most of the advice focused on financial fraud rather than systematic impersonation for purposes that didn't seem to involve stealing money or credit. Whoever was doing this seemed more interested in disrupting my life and damaging my relationships than gaining access to my bank accounts or personal financial information. The scope of the impersonation was more comprehensive than typical identity theft, suggesting someone with considerable time, technical skills, and motivation to cause problems that went beyond simple financial gain. I started documenting everything: screenshots of accounts I hadn't accessed, records of services I hadn't requested, evidence of activities that were being attributed to me despite my having no involvement in them. The documentation process led me to discover that the impersonation was happening through online platforms and services that I'd never heard of, including communities that weren't accessible through normal internet browsing. Some of the fake activities attributed to me were taking place in areas of the internet that required special software and knowledge to access, suggesting that whoever was impersonating me had technical expertise that went far beyond casual computer use. I learned how to access these hidden parts of the internet myself, hoping to understand how someone was using my identity in spaces that most people never encounter. What I found was deeply disturbing. Multiple communities dedicated to what they called identity gaming, where participants systematically impersonated real people for entertainment purposes rather than financial gain. The communities treated identity theft as a form of interactive entertainment, with members competing to see who could cause the most disruption to their chosen targets while maintaining the impersonation for extended periods. My own identity was being used by someone who had created detailed profiles of my personal and professional life, sharing updates about activities they were conducting while pretending to be me. Other community members were following my case like a television series, commenting on the effectiveness of different impersonation techniques and suggesting new ways to complicate my attempts to reclaim control of my own identity. The discussions were casual and matter-of-fact, treating real people's lives like characters in games that existed for their amusement, rather than considering the genuine harm being caused to actual individuals. Some participants specialized in particular types of identity disruption: professional sabotage, relationship interference, financial complications, even legal problems that could be created through systematic impersonation of their targets. They shared techniques for maintaining long-term impersonations, methods for accessing personal information needed to create convincing false profiles, and strategies for causing maximum disruption while avoiding detection by their victims or legal authorities. The sophistication was impressive and frightening, demonstrating that identity theft had evolved into a form of organized harassment that was conducted for entertainment rather than profit. I tried to identify which community member was impersonating me, but the discussions used pseudonyms and avoided specific personal details that might make individual participants identifiable. The person using my identity was referred to by other community members as someone who was particularly skilled at long-term impersonation projects, suggesting this wasn't their first time systematically destroying someone's life for entertainment. They had been documenting my responses to the identity interference for months, sharing updates about how I was attempting to resolve the problems they were creating, and analyzing the effectiveness of different disruption techniques. My attempts to fix the identity theft problems had been providing entertainment for an audience that was following the destruction of my life, like an ongoing reality show. The community discussions included detailed analysis of my personality, behavior patterns, and psychological responses to stress, compiled through systematic observation of how I handled the various problems they were creating. They knew intimate details about my daily routine, work habits, social relationships, and financial circumstances that could only have been gathered through comprehensive surveillance of my online and offline activities. The identity impersonation was just one component of a broader harassment campaign that included systematic monitoring of my private life and real-time analysis of how different types of interference affected my mental health and social stability. I realized that I hadn't just become the victim of identity theft, but had been selected as an unwitting participant in what amounted to a psychological experiment conducted for the entertainment of people who treated human suffering as interactive media. The games they were playing with my identity were designed to test how much disruption one person could handle before their life became completely unmanageable, with my responses being documented and shared as content for an audience that found systematic harassment amusing. I tried to report what I discovered to relevant authorities, but explaining that my identity was being used for entertainment purposes in hidden internet communities sounded like paranoid delusion, rather than verifiable criminal activity. The evidence I'd gathered was difficult to present in ways that would convince investigators who weren't familiar with the technical methods being used, or the psychological motivations behind systematic harassment for entertainment purposes. More importantly, the community discussions had made it clear that reporting their activities to authorities was considered part of the game, with participants sharing techniques for avoiding official investigation while maintaining their harassment campaigns. They had experience dealing with victims who attempted to expose their activities, using legal and technical methods to protect their identities while continuing to conduct systematic harassment of people who tried to interfere with their entertainment. Some community members had been conducting identity gaming for years without facing consequences, suggesting either that their methods were sophisticated enough to avoid detection, or that authorities lacked effective tools for investigating this type of systematic harassment. I started researching methods for protecting myself from ongoing identity theft and harassment, but discovered that most security recommendations were inadequate for dealing with determined individuals who had made systematic destruction of someone's life into a long-term entertainment project. Standard identity protection services focused on financial fraud rather than comprehensive life disruption, and most cybersecurity advice assumed attackers were motivated by profit rather than entertainment-based psychological harassment. The technical skills required to maintain long-term identity impersonation and systematic life disruption were considerable, suggesting that the people involved in identity gaming had expertise that went far beyond casual computer knowledge. But they were also patient and methodical, willing to invest months or years in harassment campaigns that provided ongoing entertainment rather than immediate gratification. About 6 months after discovering the identity gaming communities, the harassment escalated beyond online impersonation into activities that affected my physical safety and offline relationships. People started showing up at my flat looking for me in connection with activities that I'd supposedly conducted, but had never been involved in. Some were confused individuals who thought they had legitimate business with me, but others seemed genuinely angry about things they believed I'd done. My landlord received complaints about noise, activities, and behavior that were attributed to me, but which I definitely wasn't responsible for, leading to threats of eviction based on lease violations that I hadn't committed. Local businesses began refusing to serve me because of problems they claimed I'd caused during previous visits that I could prove I'd never made, creating difficulties with basic daily activities like shopping and dining. The identity gaming had evolved from online impersonation into systematic interference with my offline life, using information gathered through digital harassment to create problems in my physical environment and social relationships. I realized that the entertainment value for the identity gaming community came from watching how comprehensive life disruption affected someone's ability to function in normal society, with my increasing isolation and practical difficulties providing content for their ongoing amusement. The psychological experiments aspect of the harassment became more obvious as the problems escalated in ways that seemed designed to test specific aspects of stress tolerance and social adaptability. Different types of problems were introduced systematically, as if someone was working through a checklist of life disruption techniques to see which approaches were most effective at causing lasting damage to my mental health and social stability. The community discussions I'd found suggested that successful identity gaming projects could continue for years, with participants maintaining long-term harassment of their chosen targets, while documenting the gradual destruction of their victims' lives as ongoing entertainment content. My case was apparently considered particularly successful because I'd remained in the same location and continued attempting to maintain normal life despite the systematic interference, providing sustained content for an audience that preferred long-term psychological breakdown over quick, dramatic results. The realization that my entire life had become entertainment for people who specialized in systematic harassment was more disturbing than any individual problem they'd created, because it meant that every difficulty I experienced was providing satisfaction for an audience that wanted to see me suffer. I tried changing cities, moving to Glasgow, and attempting to start fresh with new accounts, new clients, and new social connections that weren't contaminated by the identity theft problems I'd experienced in Brighton. But within weeks of arriving in Glasgow, the same patterns began appearing. Parking tickets for cars I didn't own, account activities I hadn't initiated, professional complications caused by work I'd never agreed to do. The identity gaming community had followed me to the new location, continuing their harassment campaign with techniques that were adapted to my changed circumstances, but maintained the same systematic approach to life disruption. Moving had actually provided them with additional entertainment content as they documented my attempts to escape their harassment and analyze the effectiveness of their methods across different environments and social contexts. I realized that the identity gaming had become a permanent feature of my life, rather than a temporary problem that could be resolved through practical measures or geographic relocation. The people conducting systematic harassment had made destroying my life into a long-term project that would continue regardless of how I attempted to protect myself or rebuild my social and professional relationships. The technical sophistication and time investment required for maintaining comprehensive identity theft and life disruption suggested that this was more than casual entertainment for them, but had become a serious hobby or even professional activity that justified considerable effort and resources. I started wondering how many other people might be experiencing similar systematic harassment without understanding that their problems were being caused by individuals who had made psychological torture into interactive entertainment. The identity gaming communities I discovered were large and active, with hundreds of participants conducting harassment campaigns against targets who probably had no idea their life problems were being artificially created and maintained for other people's amusement. The casual tone of discussions about systematic life destruction suggested that this type of harassment had become normalized within these communities, with participants treating comprehensive psychological torture as routine entertainment rather than serious criminal activity. Some community members had been conducting identity gaming for years, building expertise in psychological manipulation techniques and developing specialized skills for causing different types of life disruption depending on their personal interests and their targets' vulnerabilities. The professionalization of systematic harassment for entertainment purposes meant that victims were facing individuals who had considerable experience and technical resources, making effective resistance or recovery extremely difficult without specialized knowledge and support. I continued living in Glasgow while the harassment continued, adapting to a life where every aspect of my daily routine could potentially be disrupted by people who found my suffering entertaining enough to justify years of systematic interference. The identity gaming communities continue operating. The systematic harassment of selected targets continues expanding, and people continue experiencing comprehensive life disruption without understanding that their problems are being artificially created by individuals who have made psychological torture into a form of interactive entertainment. I still work as a graphic designer when the identity theft allows clients to trust my communications, still deal with problems caused by activities I've never conducted, still wonder which people I encounter might be involved in communities that treat systematic harassment as legitimate entertainment. When your GP refers you to a specialist for problems you didn't know were serious enough to require expert attention, you generally assume the referral is legitimate medical care rather than recruitment for activities that have nothing to do with healthcare. This started about 14 months ago when I went to see Dr. Patterson about persistent headaches and sleep problems that were affecting my work as a teacher. I'd been having trouble concentrating during lessons and felt constantly tired despite getting what should have been adequate rest. Dr. Patterson ran the usual tests: blood pressure, basic neurological checks, questions about stress levels and lifestyle factors that might be contributing to my symptoms. Everything came back normal, but she seemed concerned that the headache pattern might indicate underlying issues that required more specialized evaluation. She referred me to what she called a wellness clinic that took a more comprehensive approach to diagnosing and treating stress-related health problems. The clinic supposedly used advanced assessment techniques that could identify health issues before they developed into serious medical conditions. The Exeter Wellness Institute looked professional enough when I arrived for my appointment. Modern building near the hospital, well-dressed reception staff, waiting room filled with the sort of health and lifestyle magazines you'd expect from any private medical facility. The initial consultation was more thorough than anything I'd experienced with NHS services. Dr. Kensington, the specialist who saw me, spent nearly 2 hours discussing my symptoms, work stress, lifestyle habits, and personal circumstances that might be contributing to my health problems. She explained that modern stress-related health issues were often caused by environmental factors that traditional medicine didn't adequately address: digital overwhelm, social isolation, information processing difficulties that created chronic psychological strain. The assessment process would involve monitoring my daily activities and stress responses over several weeks, using digital tools to track patterns that might not be obvious during brief medical appointments. She provided me with what appeared to be a standard health monitoring app that would record sleep patterns, activity levels, and stress indicators throughout my normal daily routine. The data would help identify specific triggers for my headaches and develop targeted interventions. The monitoring process seemed reasonable and potentially helpful for understanding what was causing my health problems. I agreed to participate and was given detailed instructions about how to use the monitoring software. But the app required access to considerably more personal information than seemed necessary for basic health monitoring. It wanted permission to access my internet browsing, social media activity, communication patterns, and even location data that would track my movements throughout each day. When I questioned the extensive data requirements, Dr. Kensington explained that modern health assessment needed to understand the complete environmental context of stress-related symptoms. Digital behavior patterns, social interactions, and daily routines all contributed to stress levels in ways that couldn't be measured through traditional medical approaches. The comprehensive monitoring would provide insights into my health issues that wouldn't be possible through conventional medical evaluation, helping identify intervention approaches that could address root causes rather than just treating symptoms. The explanation made sense from a holistic health perspective, and I was eager to find solutions for symptoms that were genuinely affecting my quality of life and professional performance. Over the following weeks, the monitoring app tracked every aspect of my daily routine with systematic thoroughness. It recorded when I went to sleep and woke up, what websites I visited, who I communicated with, where I went during weekends, even what I purchased and what television programs I watched. The data collection was remarkably comprehensive, creating what Dr. Kensington described as a complete lifestyle profile that would allow precise identification of factors contributing to my stress-related health symptoms. After about a month of monitoring, I returned for follow-up consultation to review the findings and develop a treatment plan based on the data that had been collected about my daily routine and stress patterns. Dr. Kensington presented detailed analysis of my monitoring data, identifying specific patterns that she claimed were contributing to my headaches and sleep problems. According to her assessment, my symptoms were being caused by digital overstimulation and social isolation that required targeted lifestyle interventions. The treatment plan she recommended involved gradually reducing exposure to stressful online content while increasing engagement with supportive community activities that would provide better social connection and mental stimulation. She provided access to what she called therapeutic digital environments, online communities that were specifically designed to reduce stress and promote mental well-being through positive social interaction and meaningful discussion. These communities weren't accessible through normal internet browsing, but required special software that filtered out the advertising, negativity, and information overload that characterized mainstream social media platforms. The therapeutic communities were populated by people who were dealing with similar health issues and stress-related problems, providing mutual support and discussion focused on wellness and recovery, rather than the competitive and often toxic dynamics of conventional social media. Dr. Kensington explained that spending time in these curated online environments would help retrain my stress responses while providing the sort of genuine social connection that was essential for mental and physical health. The therapeutic digital environments were indeed different from anything I'd encountered through normal internet use. The communities were focused on thoughtful discussion about health, wellness, personal development, and mutual support for people dealing with various life challenges. Participants shared experiences about managing stress, developing healthier lifestyle habits, and finding meaning and purpose in daily activities. The discussions were supportive and intellectually engaging, providing exactly the sort of positive social interaction that had been missing from my routine. I found myself genuinely enjoying the time I spent in these communities and felt that my stress levels were improving through regular participation in discussions that focused on wellness and personal growth, rather than the anxiety-provoking content that dominated mainstream social media. But as I became more involved in the therapeutic communities, I started noticing that some discussions included topics that seemed to go beyond health and wellness into areas that felt more like systematic analysis of people's personal vulnerabilities and psychological weaknesses. Some community members shared detailed information about their daily routines, personal relationships, financial circumstances, and emotional triggers with a level of specificity that seemed excessive for general wellness discussion. Others provided analysis of family members, co-workers, and social connections that read more like psychological profiling than supportive community conversation. The discussions weren't just focused on personal wellness, but were systematically documenting detailed information about participants' social networks, personal circumstances, and psychological vulnerabilities that could potentially be used for purposes beyond therapeutic support. When I questioned why wellness discussions needed such detailed personal information, other community members explained that effective stress management required understanding the complete social and psychological context of people's lives. They assured me that sharing comprehensive personal information was essential for receiving meaningful support, and that the community's therapeutic effectiveness depended on members being completely honest about their circumstances and relationships. The explanation seemed reasonable within the wellness framework that Dr. Kensington had established, and I found the community discussions genuinely helpful for managing my stress-related health symptoms. But I also started recognizing that some community participants seemed to have detailed knowledge about people in Devon, including specific information about individuals who lived and worked in areas around Exeter that I was familiar with. Some discussions included enough local detail that I began to wonder if I might recognize the people being analyzed if I encountered them during normal daily activities around the city. The therapeutic communities weren't just focused on abstract wellness discussion, but were actively collecting and analyzing detailed personal information about real people in my immediate geographic area. I realized that Dr. Kensington's health monitoring and therapeutic digital environments weren't legitimate medical treatment, but were systematic data collection operations designed to gather comprehensive personal information about Exeter area residents. My participation in wellness communities had made me complicit in activities that involve systematic analysis of real people's personal vulnerabilities and private circumstances for purposes that weren't related to healthcare or therapeutic support. The health monitoring app had been used to compile detailed profiles of my personal information, social connections, and daily routine that were being shared with communities that specialized in analyzing and potentially exploiting people's psychological and social vulnerabilities. When I tried to research the Exeter Wellness Institute more thoroughly, I discovered that it wasn't registered as a legitimate medical facility and that Dr. Kensington didn't appear in professional medical directories or have verifiable credentials through appropriate regulatory bodies. The entire wellness assessment and treatment process had been designed to collect personal information rather than provide healthcare, using medical terminology and therapeutic frameworks to make systematic data gathering seem like legitimate health services. My symptoms hadn't been treated through evidence-based medical interventions, but had been used as justification for comprehensive surveillance and information collection that was being shared with people who specialized in analyzing personal vulnerabilities for purposes that weren't related to healthcare. The therapeutic communities I'd been participating in weren't focused on wellness and mutual support, but were sophisticated information collection systems where people were encouraged to share detailed personal information that was being analyzed and potentially used for exploitation rather than therapeutic purposes. I tried to investigate what was being done with the personal information I'd shared through the wellness monitoring and community participation, leading to discovery of online spaces that weren't accessible through normal internet browsing. These hidden communities were focused on systematic analysis and potential exploitation of individuals who had been profiled through various data collection methods, including wellness services that collected comprehensive personal information under the guise of providing healthcare. The detailed personal information I'd shared through therapeutic community discussions was being used by these communities to develop profiles that could be used for targeted manipulation, harassment, or other forms of exploitation of real people in the Exeter area. My health monitoring data was being analyzed not for therapeutic purposes, but to identify psychological and social vulnerabilities that could be exploited by people who specialized in systematic manipulation of individuals they'd never met, but whose personal circumstances they understood in comprehensive detail. The wellness treatment that had supposedly addressed my stress-related health symptoms had actually made me complicit in systematic information gathering that was being used to facilitate potential exploitation of people in my own community. When I tried to withdraw from the Exeter Wellness Institute and report what I discovered about their activities, I found that my participation agreements included extensive clauses about confidentiality and data protection that made exposing their activities legally complicated. More disturbing was discovering that some people in Exeter were experiencing problems that seemed to correspond to the detailed vulnerability analyses that were being conducted in the hidden communities I discovered. Individuals whose personal information had been collected through wellness services and other data gathering operations were experiencing targeted difficulties that seemed designed to exploit the specific psychological and social vulnerabilities that had been identified through systematic analysis of their personal circumstances. My participation in what I'd believed was legitimate healthcare had contributed to information collection that was being used to facilitate systematic targeting of real people for psychological manipulation and potential exploitation. The Exeter Wellness Institute continues operating, recruiting people with genuine health concerns who believe they're receiving innovative medical treatment rather than participating in comprehensive data collection that facilitates systematic analysis of personal vulnerabilities. The therapeutic communities continue collecting detailed personal information from participants who think they're receiving mutual support for wellness and recovery rather than providing intelligence that's being used to develop exploitation profiles. People throughout Exeter continue experiencing professionally designed manipulation that's based on comprehensive analysis of personal information they shared while seeking healthcare, believing their difficulties are personal problems rather than systematic targeting by individuals who specialize in exploiting psychological vulnerabilities. I still work as a primary school teacher, still deal with occasional headaches and sleep problems, still wonder whether some of the personal and professional difficulties experienced by people around me might be caused by systematic targeting based on vulnerability analyses that were developed using information they shared while seeking legitimate medical care. The referral that seemed like access to innovative healthcare turned out to be recruitment for comprehensive data collection that facilitates systematic exploitation of vulnerable people through analysis of personal information they provided while seeking medical treatment for genuine health problems. I remember it perfectly. The way my hands shook when I first saw the invitation. Not from fear, mind you, but from pure excitement. Finally, after months of searching through dead links and forum posts that led nowhere, I'd found something real. Something that might actually prove that the stories were true. At 17, I was obsessed with urban legends. Not the obvious ones that everyone knew. Bloody Mary, the vanishing hitchhiker, that sort of nonsense. I was interested in the modern myths, the digital folklore that had grown up around the internet's darker corners. Stories about hidden websites where you could watch live murders, chat rooms where people planned real crimes, streaming services that broadcast things no civilized society should ever see. My mates thought I was mental, spending my evenings trawling through obscure forums and following breadcrumb trails that usually led to nothing but rickrolls and dead ends. But I knew there had to be something out there. The internet was too vast, too unregulated for these stories to be completely made up. Somewhere in the depths of the dark web, real horrors were happening, and I was determined to find them. The breakthrough came during the summer holidays before my final year at sixth form. My parents had gone to Spain for a fortnight, leaving me alone in our house in Kettering with strict instructions to revise for my A-levels and not throw any parties. Instead, I spent every waking hour diving deeper into corners of the internet I'd never explored before. I'd been using privacy tools for months by then, learned about them from a forum dedicated to internet mysteries. The dark web wasn't as scary as people made it out to be. Mostly just forums and marketplaces that looked like they'd been designed in the 90s. But there were layers beneath the obvious stuff. Communities that required invitations and references to access. The invitation arrived through a private message on an obscure forum about digital anthropology. The sender's username was just a string of random characters, and their profile showed they'd only joined the day before. The message was short, almost casual. They'd noticed my posts about online myths and wondered if I'd be interested in observing something authentic. A research project, they called it, studying human behavior in controlled environments. They included a link to a private chat room and a time. That night at 11:30. No explanation of what I'd be observing or why they'd chosen me specifically. Just an invitation to witness something most people would never see. I should have been suspicious. I should have realized that legitimate researchers don't recruit random teenagers from internet forums. But at 17, the possibility of finally seeing something real, something that would prove all those urban legends had a basis in fact, was too tempting to ignore. The chat room was simple, just a basic interface with a list of active users and a message window. When I connected at the appointed time, there were already 8 people online. They welcomed me warmly, asking where I was from and how I'd heard about the research project. Everyone seemed friendly, genuinely interested in my background and what had brought me to the dark web in the first place. The conversation was surprisingly normal. People discussed university courses, summer jobs, films they'd watched recently. Someone mentioned they were studying psychology at Manchester. Another person talked about their gap year travels. They could have been any group of young people chatting online, except for the undercurrent of anticipation that ran through every exchange. Around midnight, a new user joined, the same random character string who'd invited me. They thanked everyone for participating and explained that tonight's session would be particularly interesting. They'd arranged for us to observe a live demonstration of psychological pressure techniques, something that would help us understand how people responded to stress in controlled situations. A new window opened in my browser, showing what appeared to be a small, windowless room with concrete walls. A single chair sat in the center, facing multiple cameras. The lighting was harsh, clinical, like something from a hospital or laboratory. It looked exactly like the red rooms described in all those urban legends, except there was nothing obviously sinister about it. Just an empty room with professional-looking equipment. The chat exploded with excitement. Everyone seemed genuinely thrilled to be witnessing what they called a breakthrough in behavioral research. They discussed the camera angles, the lighting setup, the professional quality of the production. It felt academic, scientific, like we were part of something important rather than something wrong. Then someone entered the room. It was a young man, probably not much older than me, wearing casual clothes and looking confused about where he was. He examined the chair, the cameras, the concrete walls with growing bewilderment. The researcher who'd invited us explained through the chat that this was a volunteer who'd agreed to participate in the study, though the specific nature of the experiment had been kept confidential to ensure authentic responses. The other viewers began making observations about the subject's behavior, noting his body language and facial expressions with the detached interest of psychology students. They discussed his apparent anxiety levels, speculated about his background, made predictions about how he would respond to different stimuli. I found myself caught up in their enthusiasm. This was exactly what I'd been searching for. Proof that the internet's hidden corners contained genuine research, real experiments that pushed the boundaries of what was considered ethical. The academic tone of the discussion made everything feel legitimate, important, like we were witnessing something that would advance human understanding. The volunteer was asked to sit in the chair. Through the chat, the researcher explained that they would be testing various psychological pressure techniques, measuring how quickly social isolation and peer pressure could influence decision-making. The cameras would record everything for later analysis by university research teams. What followed was subtle at first. The volunteer was asked simple questions through speakers we couldn't see, his answers recorded by the cameras from multiple angles. The chat observers discussed his responses, noting signs of stress or discomfort, predicting how long it would take for the isolation to affect his mental state. But gradually, the atmosphere in the chat began to shift. The academic discussion became more personal, more focused on the individual rather than the research. People started making comments about the volunteer's appearance, his nervousness, the way he kept looking at the cameras as if seeking help that wasn't coming. Someone suggested that the experiment would be more effective with multiple subjects. The researcher agreed, explaining that they'd been hoping to expand the study, but had struggled to find suitable volunteers. The work was too important to abandon, they said, and the insights they were gaining were invaluable. That's when they asked if any of us would be interested in participating directly. The request was casual, almost offhand. They'd learned so much from observing our reactions in the chat, the researcher explained, that having one of us experience the experiment firsthand would provide crucial comparative data. It would only take a few hours, and participants would be contributing to groundbreaking research into human psychology. The other chat users immediately began encouraging me to volunteer. They said I'd shown the most insight during the observation, that my comments had demonstrated a real understanding of the psychological principles at work. The researcher agreed, noting that my posts on the forum had shown exceptional maturity for someone my age. I felt flattered, chosen. These people, who seemed so knowledgeable and sophisticated, were telling me I had something special to offer. The volunteer in the room was clearly finding the experience difficult, but that was the point. Real research required genuine responses, and I would be helping advance scientific understanding in ways most people never could. The arrangements was surprisingly simple. They would send a car to collect me the following evening. The session would take place at a research facility in Birmingham, not far from where I lived. I would be driven home afterwards, and my participation would remain completely confidential. They even mentioned a small payment for my time, though they stressed that the real reward would be the knowledge that I'd contributed to important academic work. I agreed without really thinking it through. The combination of flattery, peer pressure, and genuine curiosity overrode any sensible concerns I might have had. These people seemed legitimate, professional, interested in real research rather than anything sinister. And after months of searching for authentic mysteries, the chance to be part of something genuine was impossible to resist. The car arrived exactly when they'd said it would. A black saloon with tinted windows, driven by a middle-aged man who seemed pleasant enough. He didn't talk much during the journey, just confirmed my name and explained that we'd be arriving at the facility within the hour. But as we drove through Birmingham's outskirts, I began to notice things that didn't feel right. The route we were taking didn't lead to any university campus or research facility I was familiar with. Instead, we seemed to be heading towards an industrial area, full of warehouses and abandoned factories. When I asked about our destination, the driver just smiled and said we'd be there soon. The research facility was deliberately located away from populated areas, he explained, to ensure complete privacy for sensitive experiments. Academic ethics required absolute confidentiality, especially when dealing with cutting-edge psychological research. We pulled up outside a nondescript warehouse with no signs or identifying features. Just a building that could have contained anything, surrounded by empty car parks and darkened windows. The driver led me to a side entrance and used a key card to let us in. Inside, the warehouse had been converted into something that looked more like a television studio than a research facility. Professional lighting equipment, multiple cameras, and in the center of the space, a small concrete room with a single chair facing the cameras. The same room I'd been watching through my computer screen the night before. That's when I realized that the friendly chat room observers, the academic researcher, the volunteer I'd watched with such detached interest, none of it had been real. Or rather, it had been real, but not in the way I'd understood. I hadn't been observing a research project. I'd been watching an audition. The other people were already there, waiting. The same usernames from the chat room, but now revealed as ordinary-looking adults with cameras and recording equipment. They greeted me with the same friendly enthusiasm they'd shown online, explaining that everything was set up for tonight's session. I was the volunteer now, the one who would sit in the chair while others watched and discussed my responses with academic detachment. Except there was nothing academic about it, and the people observing weren't psychology students or researchers. They were just people who enjoyed watching others in distress. The transition happened so gradually that I didn't immediately recognize it as coercion. They asked if I wanted to see the setup, if I was curious about how the equipment worked, whether I'd like to experience the same experiment I'd found so fascinating the night before. Their tone remained friendly, encouraging, as if this was all part of the natural progression from observer to participant. But when I said I'd changed my mind, that I wanted to go home, their demeanor shifted. Not dramatically. They didn't become threatening or aggressive. Instead, they became disappointed, as if I was letting down the team after they'd invested so much time and effort in bringing me there. They reminded me of how enthusiastic I'd been the night before, how much insight I'd shown into the psychological principles at work. They'd specifically chosen me, they said, because I'd demonstrated such maturity and understanding. Backing out now would ruin months of preparation and waste the opportunity to contribute to something genuinely important. The peer pressure was subtle but relentless. They made me feel selfish for wanting to leave, ungrateful for the opportunity I'd been given, immature for not following through on my commitment. And always, underlying everything, was the implication that I didn't really have a choice anymore. I'd come there voluntarily, they pointed out. I'd agreed to participate in the research. I'd been driven to a location I couldn't identify, with people whose real names I didn't know. Who would believe that I'd been coerced if I tried to report what was happening? The chair sat in the center of the room, surrounded by cameras and lights, waiting for me to take my place. They assured me it would only take a few hours, that thousands of people online were waiting to observe the session, that my participation would provide valuable insights into human psychology. But I knew now that the people watching wouldn't be interested in academic research. They would be paying customers, anonymous viewers, who enjoyed watching real fear and genuine distress. The urban legends I'd spent months trying to prove were real, and I was about to become part of one. That was 3 months ago. I never sat in the chair, managed to get away when the driver stepped outside for a cigarette break and left the warehouse door unlocked. I ran through unfamiliar streets until I found a main road and flagged down a taxi. Made it home before my parents returned from their holiday. I've never reported what happened. Who would believe that I'd stumbled into a real Red Room operation while searching for urban legends? The police would think I was making it up, or worse, that I'd been involved in something I shouldn't have been. But sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to sleep, I wonder about that chair, whether it's still there, in that converted warehouse in Birmingham's industrial district, whether other teenagers, drawn by the same curiosity that nearly destroyed me, are discovering friendly chat rooms and academic research projects that promise to show them something real. And I wonder whether any of them are smart enough to run when they realize what they've actually found. The invitation messages still arrive occasionally, from different usernames on different forums. Always the same casual tone, the same promise of authentic observation opportunities. I delete them immediately now, but I can't delete the knowledge that somewhere out there the chair is waiting. The strangest thing about discovering that your entire life has been arranged by someone else is how normal everything seems until you realize that none of your important decisions were actually your own. And by then, it's far too late to change direction without destroying everything you think you built for yourself. I was 31 when I got offered what seemed like a perfect opportunity to advance my career while helping vulnerable people in ways that weren't possible through traditional counsel services. The offer came through professional channels that looked completely legitimate, targeting exactly the sort of specialized expertise I'd developed over 6 years of working with families in crisis. The job was with something called the Community Resilience Project, described as an innovative approach to social intervention that used data analysis and digital outreach to identify and support at-risk individuals before they reach the point of requiring statutory services. The salary was considerably higher than council work, and the methodology sounded like exactly the kind of forward-thinking social work that could genuinely make a difference. During the interview process, they explained that traditional social services were reactive rather than preventative, waiting for problems to escalate before providing support. The Community Resilience Project aimed to identify vulnerable individuals early and provide discreet assistance before their situations became critical enough to require official intervention. The work would involve analyzing digital footprints and online behavior patterns to identify people who showed signs of developing mental health crises, financial difficulties, or social isolation that could lead to more serious problems if left untreated. My role would be to develop intervention strategies based on psychological profiles compiled from digital sources, creating personalized outreach approaches that could provide support without stigmatizing recipients or creating bureaucratic complications that might prevent them from accepting help. The methodology seemed innovative and ethically sound, using technology to provide early support rather than waiting for people to request help when their situations had already become desperate. I accepted the position and was introduced to the digital analysis tools that the project used to identify potential intervention targets. The software was sophisticated, capable of analyzing social media activity, online purchasing patterns, communication styles, and even browsing habits to create comprehensive psychological profiles. The profiles were remarkably detailed, providing insights into people's mental states, social relationships, financial circumstances, and personal vulnerabilities that would have been impossible to gather through traditional social work assessment methods. My first assignment was developing intervention strategies for individuals in Cardiff and surrounding areas who had been identified as potentially at risk based on their digital behavior patterns. The profile suggested people who were experiencing depression, financial stress, social isolation, or other conditions that might benefit from early support. The intervention strategies I developed were carefully designed to appear like coincidental opportunities rather than organized assistance. Rather than contacting people directly and explaining that they'd been identified as needing support, the project would create situations where help would be offered in ways that preserved recipients' dignity and autonomy. For someone experiencing financial difficulties, this might involve arranging for them to hear about job opportunities that match their skills, or ensuring they encountered information about financial assistance programs they hadn't known existed. For individuals showing signs of depression or social isolation, interventions might involve connecting them with hobby groups, volunteer opportunities, or social activities that addressed their specific interests and psychological needs. The approach was elegant and ethical, providing genuine help while avoiding the stigmatization and bureaucracy that prevented many people from accessing traditional social services. Over several months, I developed intervention strategies for dozens of Cardiff area residents, creating carefully crafted approaches that would provide support for their specific circumstances while maintaining the appearance of natural opportunities rather than organized assistance. The work was intellectually challenging and emotionally rewarding, combining digital analysis with traditional social work skills to create innovative support systems that could genuinely improve people's lives. But as I continued developing interventions and tracking their outcomes, I started noticing patterns that made me uncomfortable about the true nature of the Community Resilience Project. Some of the digital profiles were more detailed than seemed possible through analysis of publicly available online information, including knowledge of private communications, personal relationships, and financial circumstances that wouldn't be accessible without systematic invasion of privacy. The psychological insights contained in the profiles suggested access to information that could only be obtained through comprehensive surveillance rather than analysis of voluntary digital activity. More concerning was discovering that some intervention targets were people I recognized from my previous counsel work, individuals whose personal circumstances and vulnerabilities I knew from direct professional contact. The profiles of these familiar cases were accurate in ways that suggested access to confidential social services records, therapeutic notes, and other professional information that should have been protected by various privacy regulations. I realized that the Community Resilience Project wasn't just analyzing publicly available digital information, but was accessing confidential personal data from multiple sources to create comprehensive surveillance profiles of Cardiff area residents. When I raised concerns about data protection and privacy violations, my project supervisors explained that preventing social crisis sometimes required accessing information through methods that weren't strictly conventional, but which were justified by the protective purposes they served. They assured me that all information was obtained through partnerships with legitimate organizations, and that privacy concerns were outweighed by the potential benefits of preventing serious social problems before they escalated into situations requiring emergency intervention. The ethical framework made sense from a utilitarian perspective. Violating privacy to prevent greater harm could be justified if the interventions genuinely improved people's lives and prevented more serious problems. But I also started recognizing that the intervention strategies I was developing weren't always producing the protective outcomes that had been described during my recruitment. Some targets were experiencing problems that seemed to worsen after interventions were implemented, as if the support strategies were designed to create dependency or vulnerability rather than promote genuine resilience. Others were receiving interventions that seemed designed to manipulate their behavior in specific directions, rather than simply providing assistance with their existing difficulties. The intervention approaches I was developing weren't just offering help, but were systematically influencing people's decision-making processes to produce outcomes that weren't necessarily in their best interests. I started researching the Community Resilience Project more thoroughly, trying to understand who was funding the work and what ultimate outcomes the interventions were designed to achieve. What I discovered was deeply disturbing. The Community Resilience Project wasn't a legitimate social innovation program, but was a front for systematic manipulation and control of vulnerable individuals identified through comprehensive digital surveillance. The intervention strategies I was developing weren't designed to help at-risk people, but were being used to create psychological dependency and social isolation that made targets more vulnerable to exploitation rather than more resilient. The digital profiles weren't being compiled to identify people who needed support, but to identify individuals who could be systematically manipulated through carefully designed intervention strategies that appeared helpful but were actually designed to increase their vulnerability. My expertise in social work and psychological assessment was being used to develop manipulation techniques that were disguised as supportive interventions, helping harmful actors gain control over vulnerable people while maintaining the appearance of providing legitimate assistance. The people I was supposedly helping were actually being targeted for exploitation through intervention strategies that I had designed based on comprehensive psychological profiles compiled through systematic invasion of their privacy. I tried to investigate which organizations were actually behind the Community Resilience Project and how the information I was providing about intervention targets was being used. The investigation led me to discover online communities that weren't accessible through normal internet browsing, where people discussed systematic manipulation and exploitation of vulnerable individuals using techniques that were very similar to the intervention strategies I'd been developing. These communities treated psychological manipulation as entertainment, sharing success stories about gaining control over targets and using their vulnerabilities for various forms of exploitation. Some participants specialized in financial exploitation, using psychological manipulation to convince targets to provide money or access to resources. Others focused on social and emotional exploitation, creating dependency relationships that allowed them to control targets' behavior and decision-making processes. The intervention strategies I'd been developing were being used by these communities as sophisticated manipulation techniques, with my professional social work expertise providing the psychological insights needed to make exploitation appear like genuine assistance The Community Resilience Project was essentially a recruitment and training system for people who wanted to exploit vulnerable individuals, using my professional skills to develop more effective manipulation techniques while providing academic cover that made the activities seem legitimate. The Cardiff area residents I'd been creating intervention strategies for weren't receiving protective support, but were being targeted for systematic exploitation by individuals who used my professionally developed manipulation techniques to gain control over their lives. My social work expertise had been used to create a comprehensive system for identifying and exploiting vulnerable people. With the intervention strategies I developed, providing the psychological manipulation framework that made exploitation possible, while maintaining the appearance of legitimate assistance. When I tried to expose what I'd discovered about the Community Resilience Project, I found that my employment contract included extensive confidentiality clauses that made reporting their activities legally complicated and potentially expensive. More concerning was discovering that some of the people I'd developed intervention strategies for were now experiencing exactly the sort of social and financial crises that the project had supposedly been designed to prevent. The intervention strategies I'd created had been successful at making vulnerable people more vulnerable rather than more resilient, with my professional expertise being used to systematically destroy the lives of people who had been selected for exploitation, based on psychological profiles I'd helped analyze. I never found a way to safely extract myself from involvement with the Community Resilience Project, or to warn the Cardiff area residents who were being targeted using manipulation techniques I'd developed. The project continues operating, expanding its surveillance and manipulation activities, while recruiting additional social work professionals who believe they're contributing to innovative prevention programs rather than sophisticated exploitation systems. People throughout Cardiff continue experiencing professionally designed manipulation, disguised as community support, while believing their difficulties are personal failures rather than systematic targeting by individuals who have made psychological exploitation into a technical specialty. I still work in social services, trying to provide genuine support for vulnerable people while knowing that some of the intervention techniques I developed are being used to exploit others in ways that would be impossible without professional psychological expertise. The assignment that seemed like an opportunity to advance my career while helping vulnerable people turned out to be developing manipulation techniques for systematic exploitation of the same types of people I'd become a social worker to protect. My professional expertise continues being used to harm vulnerable individuals throughout Cardiff, while the Community Resilience Project continues recruiting social work professionals who believe they're contributing to innovative prevention programs, rather than providing technical support for systematic psychological exploitation disguised as community assistance. My parents hired me to house sit for the Williamses while they were on holiday in Spain, promising it would be easy money for watching an empty Victorian terrace in Bath for 2 weeks. But Mrs. Williams had left me instructions that made no sense for normal house-sitting duties. I was 24 and working part-time at a garden centre while trying to save enough money to move out of my parents' house in nearby Bristol. So £200 for essentially living rent-free in a beautiful period property seemed like perfect timing. The instructions Mrs. Williams had left were unusually detailed, covering not just the basics about watering plants and collecting post, but specific schedules for opening and closing curtains, times when I should leave lights on in particular rooms, and even requirements about which television programs to have playing at certain hours. She'd emphasized that maintaining normal household activity patterns was essential for security purposes. though the level of precision seemed excessive for deterring casual burglars. The house was exactly as impressive as I'd expected from the outside. 3 stories of original Victorian features, period furniture, and the sort of tasteful decoration that suggested comfortable middle-class prosperity. But as I settled in for my first evening, I started noticing things that made me uncomfortable about why Mrs. Williams might need such specific activity simulation. The curtains were positioned to be visible from multiple angles outside the house, suggesting someone might be observing whether the instructions were being followed correctly. Some rooms had furniture arrangements that seemed designed more for external visibility than comfortable living, with seating positioned where occupants would be clearly visible through windows. Most unsettling was discovering that several rooms contained equipment that wasn't mentioned in the house-sitting instructions. Cameras, recording devices, and monitoring systems that suggested the property was being used for purposes beyond normal family residence. I found extensive networking equipment in a basement room that Mrs. Williams hadn't shown me during the initial tour, along with multiple computer systems that appeared to be running continuously, despite the family being on holiday. The basement setup looked more like a professional surveillance operation than home security, with equipment that would be expensive and technically complex for casual residential use. I started paying closer attention to the specific instructions Mrs. Williams had provided, trying to understand why normal household activities needed to be performed on such rigid schedules. The curtain timings corresponded to periods when external observation would be optimal. Lighting schedules ensured that occupied rooms would be clearly visible from outside, and television programming requirements created audio backgrounds that could mask other activities. Rather than deterring surveillance, the instructions seemed designed to facilitate it, ensuring that someone watching the house would see exactly what they expected during specific time periods. I researched the neighborhood and found that several other properties had been used for similar house-sitting arrangements, with local students and young people hired to maintain activity patterns, while homeowners were supposedly traveling. But some of these house-sitters had reported unusual experiences during their stays, technical problems with internet and phone connections, evidence that their activities were being monitored more closely than normal security would require, and instructions that seemed designed for purposes beyond simple property protection. A few had discovered that the houses they were staying in contained equipment and activities that weren't related to normal residential use, but were too concerned about losing their house-sitting income to report these discoveries officially. I decided to investigate the basement equipment more thoroughly, hoping to understand what the Williamses were actually using their property for when they weren't supposedly on holiday. The computer systems were running software that I didn't recognize, but which appeared to be hosting services that were accessible through networks that weren't part of normal internet infrastructure. Some of the systems were streaming video content that seemed to originate from various residential properties, suggesting that the Williams house was part of a broader surveillance network rather than just individually monitored. The content being streamed included footage from inside homes where people were going about normal daily activities, apparently unaware that their private lives were being documented and broadcast to remote audiences. I found evidence that the Williams property itself was generating similar content, with cameras positioned throughout the house capturing activities that had been taking place during previous house-sitting arrangements. The detailed instructions I'd been given were designed to ensure that house-sitters performed predictable activities that would create interesting content for whoever was monitoring the surveillance feeds. I realized that I hadn't been hired to protect an empty house, but to provide live entertainment for people who were paying to watch unsuspecting young people go about their daily routines in what they thought was private residential space. The equipment in the basement was broadcasting my activities to audiences who were paying for access to voyeuristic content featuring people who had no idea they were being observed. Mrs. Williams hadn't gone on holiday at all. She had temporarily relocated while her house was being used as a streaming location for surveillance content that would be impossible to capture if the actual residents were present. I should have left immediately and reported what I'd discovered to appropriate authorities, but I was also curious about the scope of the surveillance network and how many other house sitters might be unknowingly providing content for similar audiences. I researched the hidden internet services that the basement equipment was connecting to, trying to understand how residential surveillance content was being distributed and monetized. The access methods required software that went beyond normal browsing, but the communities I found were surprisingly active, with hundreds of participants discussing surveillance content from various residential properties throughout the UK. The house-sitting scheme was just one method for accessing private residential spaces, with other approaches including fake maintenance visits, temporary accommodation arrangements, and even legitimate rental properties that contained hidden surveillance equipment. The audiences were paying for access to authentic private behavior rather than staged performances, creating a market for content that could only be captured through systematic deception of unsuspecting individuals. My own activities in the Williams house were being discussed in real time by viewers who rated different house sitters based on their appearance, daily routines, and entertainment value for surveillance audiences. Some discussions included detailed analysis of my personal habits, speculation about my private life, and suggestions for ways that future house-sitting arrangements could be structured to generate more compelling content. The participants treated house-sitters like unpaid performers in ongoing reality shows, discussing our activities with the sort of casual familiarity that suggested they'd been watching residential surveillance content for extended periods. I tried to investigate how many other properties in Bath might be part of similar surveillance schemes, looking for patterns in house-sitting advertisements and residential rental arrangements that might indicate systematic exploitation. The scope was larger than I'd initially understood, with multiple properties throughout the city being used for surveillance content generation through various deceptive arrangements. Some involved fake holiday rentals where guests unknowingly provided content for surveillance audiences. Others used maintenance access to install permanent monitoring equipment in legitimate residential properties. The network had developed sophisticated methods for accessing private residential spaces while maintaining plausible explanations that would protect the surveillance activities from official investigation. I realized that discovering the surveillance had made me a problem that needed to be managed, as my investigation could potentially expose the broader network of properties and compromise their ability to continue generating content through deceptive arrangements. About a week into my house-sitting stay, I started experiencing technical problems that seemed designed to isolate me from outside communication, while ensuring I remained in the property to continue providing surveillance content. Phone and internet connections became unreliable, making it difficult to research the surveillance network or contact people who might help me address what I'd discovered. The problems were sophisticated enough to suggest deliberate interference rather than routine technical difficulties, but subtle enough that reporting them wouldn't result in immediate investigation. I realized that the surveillance network had methods for managing house sitters who discovered their activities, using technical manipulation to prevent exposure while encouraging continued participation through isolation and dependency. The house-sitting arrangement had been designed not just to generate surveillance content, but to trap participants in situations where they couldn't easily escape or report what they were experiencing. Mrs. Williams returned from her supposed holiday exactly when scheduled. Acting as if nothing unusual had occurred, and thanking me for maintaining the property so well during her absence. But her knowledge of my activities during the house-sitting period was considerably more detailed than could be explained by normal security monitoring, including awareness of my investigation into the basement equipment and research into surveillance communities. She paid me the promised fee and mentioned that they might need house-sitting services again in the future, suggesting that my performance had been satisfactory for their actual purposes. The casual way she discussed my stay made it clear that she understood I'd discovered the surveillance activities, but wasn't concerned about potential consequences. I left the Williams house with £200 and the understanding that residential surveillance networks operated with sophistication and confidence that suggested minimal concern about official investigation or legal consequences. The house-sitting advertisements continue to appear in local publications, offering easy money for watching empty properties while homeowners travel, attracting students and young people who need income and housing flexibility. But I'm also aware that some of these opportunities involve providing unpaid entertainment for surveillance audiences who pay for access to authentic private behavior captured through systematic deception of people who think they're performing simple property protection services. The Victorian Terrace in Bath continues to host house-sitters who follow detailed instructions designed to generate compelling surveillance content, while Mrs. Williams continues to recruit young people who need money and don't ask too many questions about why normal house-sitting requires such specific performance schedules.